When we're talking about the endocrine system, we're looking at different cells and tissues that are going to make about 30 different hormones. Hormones are chemical messengers, and we will get the actual definition of hormones in a few slides. They are going to do things like controlling and coordinating the various processes in the body that allow for sleep, temperature, hunger, growth, etc. There's a lot of things that hormones are responsible for, and because of this complex coordinated interaction, it does sometimes become confusing for students to really understand how everything works together. So that's why I do want you to make sure that you are processing things as you are learning them, because if you don't learn the very first parts, then it will be very difficult to understand things later on, especially as we get into the different systems that have hormones, and you'll need to know exactly how those things work together. So take your time and don't feel like you have to rush through this. For the endocrine system, there are a number of things that can disrupt the homeostasis within the body, including things like soy foods and soy formulas. So I put a little website there for you that you can actually look at and look at some of the endocrine disruptors. You may be very surprised at the different things that are considered to be endocrine disruptors. If you've never heard of endocrine disruptors, then just go to Google, type in endocrine disruptors, and it will give you lots of different links where you can look at the various things that can cause problems within the endocrine system. Super important to know that on a clinical level, because sometimes people are exposing themselves to things that they don't even know are endocrine disruptors, and we have so many different hormonal problems in patients nowadays that even doing little things like staying away from certain makeups or certain hygiene products, or maybe even using a different dry cleaning company, all of those things will make a difference long term as you support that patient in the areas where they need greater support. The endocrine system is going to produce, it's going to be all of the endocrine cells and tissues that will produce hormones, or what we call paracrines. We'll talk about paracrines in a second. The endocrine cells will release these secretions into extracellular fluid. So when we look at how the endocrine system works, you'll see that this is going to be using the bloodstream. So that's very, very important to understand. And we have endocrine organs that are scattered all throughout the body. For this particular chart, you can see here that there's different ways that cells have to communicate with one another. The red box outlines our big focus on what we're really going to be learning in this particular PowerPoint. Some of the things you're already familiar with. For those things that you're not remembering so much, you can just kind of use this chart to put back into your memory, oh yes, I do remember when we talked about for instance, the nervous system, how it communicates through the synaptic gap. When I make my PowerPoints, I always have slides that will have a picture for those people who learn best from pictorial images, and then I have that followed up by slides where there's a more detailed explanation of that picture in words for those people who learn better by verbal cues or through reading. So if reading is not your thing, you do not have to utilize all of the word slides, but they are there for those of you who do need them. So I am just going to focus on just this chart right here as I talk through the different types of communication, and I'm going to give the big forest picture. If you want more details or words are your thing, then the next few slides are especially for you. So when we look at the first one, direct communication, you can see here that there are two cells that are right next to each other, and this communication is going to be done through gap junctions. So these can be things like ions or lipid-soluble materials that can go from cell to cell, but the cells are very, very close to one another. Whereas paracrine communication, this is going to be going through the extracellular fluid because these cells are no longer touching each other. It's still going to be local, so those other cells are still going to be close, and those other cells have to have certain receptors in order to understand what the chemical message is that is being sent from the original cell. The autocrine communication, remember auto means self, is also going to communicate through extracellular fluid. However, this is specifically for the cell that actually secretes the hormone itself. So it will be coming right back to the original secretor instead of going on to a different type of cell. Endocrine communication, the key here is through the bloodstream. So make sure that you circle that, because you can see here that that blood vessel that is there is going to be the way that the hormones can travel all throughout the body, because we have some hormones that are going to be in the brain, and some signals need to be sent all the way down to the pelvic cavity, maybe into the ovary or into the testes. So it has to utilize the blood vessels in order to get from one location to another, because there's going to be a very far distance in between certain cells that need to communicate with our endocrine hormones. For synaptic communication, you learned this in 2401 on how the nervous system is going to utilize neurotransmitters across the synaptic gap in order to make very quick responses for changes that need to occur within the nervous system. So those are your different ways that you have intracellular communication. And again, our big focus for this particular PowerPoint is going to be on that endocrine communication through the bloodstream. So again, for you words people, you've got a couple of different slides that will help you with the more detailed explanation of each individual type of communication. Okay, so when we're looking at the endocrine system, one thing to keep in mind is that it is very much like the nervous system, and that it is going to rely on the release of chemicals that are going to need receptors. And the endocrine system and the nervous system both share many of the same chemical messengers. These systems are also going to be regulated mainly by negative feedback, and if you do not remember what negative feedback is, I highly encourage you to go back and look that up, because it is so important in order to maintain homeostasis to understand negative feedback. We do want to also remember that the nervous system is very, very fast, whereas the endocrine system works at a much slower pace. If you've ever known anybody with a hormonal imbalance, or you've ever worked with any patients who are trying to fix their hormone levels, it takes time. This isn't anything that you can rush, because the endocrine system is much slower. We know the nervous system is quick, which is why whenever you put your hand down on a hot stove, you're immediately going to draw away, because the nervous system is going to send those signals very, very, very fast. But the endocrine system doesn't work like that. So here's your definition for hormones. Chemical messengers, so keep in mind, they are chemical, they are messengers. They're going to be released from one tissue, transported in that blood to alter the activities or specific cells in other tissues. So that green definition, make sure you remember that so that we know what the role of the hormone is and what it is ultimately trying to achieve. As the hormones are being released and they're going through the bloodstream, ultimately what they're going to be looking for are what we call target cells. So just as you would throw a dart to a target in order to try to hit the bullseye, those hormones are looking for their target as well. The target cells have to have receptors in order to get those hormones to bind to the cell and then read what that message is of what the hormone wants the cell to actually do. So receptors are super important. We'll talk about them a little bit more here in a minute. Just make sure that you know that those target cells, if they don't have the receptors, the message cannot be read, and therefore homeostasis is not going to be maintained. When the hormones dock on those receptors, there's a couple of different things that can happen. As you can see there, it can change the types, quantities, or activities of enzymes and structural proteins in the target cells. It can alter metabolic activities. It can help with processes like growth and development. There's a number of things that can be done because there's so many different hormones. So as you're going through and learning each different hormone, you'll be learning where does it come from, where is it going, and what is it supposed to do. Alright, so here we will talk about our receptors. A receptor is a protein molecule to which a particular molecule binds very strongly. It's a protein, which means good, high-quality proteins are vital for your endocrine system to work appropriately. Now, we have to have these good proteins, not just for hormone levels or for receptor molecules, but for a number of different things inside of our system as well. It's very important that whenever you choose your foods, you choose high quality proteins. I know there's a lot of debate. I've seen a ton of documentaries. I've read about it all in regards to the vegan movement and why people think that you really shouldn't eat animal proteins. There's a lot of documentaries that I disagree with out there. Veganism is not for everybody. For some people it does work really well, as long as they're doing a good job maintaining adequate protein levels and getting all of their essential amino acids. It can be done. For some people it is really great. For other people, they really struggle and have a very hard time and make themselves very sick. So each individual person needs to take into account what is best for their body. There is not a one-size-fits-all whenever it comes to nutrition. Different people need different things because they have different health backgrounds, different health requirements, different health history. So it's very important to not get in disarray whenever you eat one way and then somebody else eats another way and trying to tell them that they're wrong or whatever. We don't need to have arguments based upon a one-size-fits-all approach. Each individual patient should have a personalized approach to their specific needs. But proteins are absolutely necessary for everyone in order to make sure that things work correctly in the system. Different tissues will have different combinations of receptors, and it's going to be the presence or the absence of a specific receptor that will determine hormonal sensitivity of a cell. Obviously, if that receptor is absent, then we're going to have a problem with sensitivity. The hormone receptors can be located either on the plasma membrane. If they are, we will call these extracellular receptors, or within the target cells. And if they're inside, then we'll call them intracellular receptors. So those two words totally make sense. In regards to the sensitivity, it's important to understand that because the body is in a constant state of change, and the body is constantly looking at what are the external factors that are around me. Am I around some very, very cold temperature and I need to change some things? Or is it very, very hot? Or am I in a very, very smoky environment, etc., etc.? It's going to change what's going on internally as well, so the body has to constantly measure what's happening internally. Do I have too much carbon dioxide in my system? Is my oxygen becoming too low? So the body is constantly aware of the things that are changing, both in external and internal environment. And we do have to have the ability to have some flexibility. So the upregulation and the downregulation help keep the cells flexible in order to respond to various changing conditions. In some cases, this can work against the body, especially when the body is exposed to toxins it does not recognize. Toxins are huge in our world. We have more toxins now in our environment than we ever have before. And that's because there's an advent of so many new products, so many new things, and they don't all get tested and regulated as well as they should. Very important to try to stay away from as many toxins as you can. Obviously, you cannot live in a bubble, but you don't want to be putting things maybe like on your skin. You may not even know that the lotion that you're using has a ton of toxins in it and could be really bad for you. A great website for anything that is hygiene related, like shampoos, conditioners, lotions, deodorants, etc., is ewg.org/skindeep. EWG is the environmental working group, and they have a Skin Deep database, which is phenomenal in talking about the different toxins that are in various beauty and hygiene products. So if it's as simple as removing some of the products from your life that are causing a toxin buildup, that's one of the things that can help with hormonal regulation, especially for patients who are having a hard time with hormonal imbalances. So let's talk about how downregulation and upregulation work. In downregulation, what you want to remember is this is a decrease in sensitivity. The decrease in sensitivity happens because the presence of a hormone triggers a decrease in the number of hormone receptors. So lower receptors is a lower sensitivity. When that level of that hormone is very, very high, the cell becomes less sensitive to it. And the opposite is going to happen on upregulation. It's the absence of a hormone that will trigger an increase in the number of hormone receptors. So, think about it like this. As an example, if you're a parent, you will totally understand this. If you're not a parent, then maybe if you have brothers and sisters, nieces and nephews, you might understand this as well. If I am home with all 4 of my kids, so I have 4 children, if all of them are here and all of them are calling my name and they're constantly needing something, Mom, where is this? Mom, can I eat this? Mom, can I go outside? Mom, can I do this? Mom, can such and such come over? If I'm constantly being bombarded with signals of mom, 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 then that level of signaling is so high that I'm going to eventually start becoming less sensitive to it. My ears are going to start to shut them out. I'm going to stop paying attention to them. I'm going to stop answering questions because they're overwhelming me. I'm probably even going to go to my room. I'm not going to lie. Shut the door so that I could just have a moment to be away from all of the stimulation. Now, if all of my kids leave for a week and they go to grandma's house or best friend's house and everybody is gone, then their absence is going to trigger in me a desire to have a greater sensitivity to them. I am going to want them back. I'm going to start thinking to myself, oh my gosh, I love my kids so much. Why did I let all of them leave? I can't wait till they come back. My sensitivity to them is growing because of their absence. So that's how things work in downregulation and upregulation with hormones. Too much hormonal stimulation, downregulation. The absence of the hormonal stimulation, we're going to become more sensitive, and that's upregulation. As we go through and learn about the different hormones, you'll see some of the examples of how downregulation and upregulation can work. It's really the easiest to understand, in my opinion, in regards to blood glucose levels and how the hormones insulin and glucagon work to help that downregulation and upregulation. Okay, so let's talk about some of these glands and some of these hormones. This is just a general overview. We are going to get much deeper into the particular hormones in parts B and part C, but just as a general overview, let's start out with the hypothalamus. Next to that word, I want you to write the king, K-I-N-G. The hypothalamus is the king of the endocrine system, and the hypothalamus is the connection between the nervous system and the endocrine system. So you learned about hypothalamus in 2401 in the nervous system, but it's also the king of the endocrine system, which makes it a VIP organ. It is going to produce ADH, OXT, and regulatory hormones, which we'll talk about more later on. That pituitary gland that is connected to the hypothalamus via the infundibulum, which is just a little stalk that connects the two. The pituitary gland, you can note this as the queen. So the queen, you can see here, is going to do a whole lot of work. Whenever we're looking at, let's say, a kingdom, although the king may give the orders, the queen may be the one who does a whole lot of work behind the scenes. So the pituitary gland is incredibly busy and has a lot of things that it is responsible for. The pituitary gland is divided into 2 different sections. So we have an anterior section and a posterior section known as lobes. And there's going to be a different hormone group that is released from anterior versus posterior. Again, we'll get into that later. The pineal gland is going to be in the posterior aspect of the brain, more near the cerebellum area, as you can see there in the picture, and it is responsible for releasing melatonin, which is that gland that that hormone that is going to help you with sleeping at night. The parathyroid gland, parathyroid starts with a P. The parathyroid is on the posterior thyroid, and it will release parathyroid hormone. The thyroid gland releases thyroid hormones, T3 and T4, but do not forget that it also is going to release calcitonin. So a lot of people forget that the thyroid gland does the calcitonin release as well, so maybe put a little star right there to help you with remembering that is going to come from your thyroid. Moving on inferiorly, we have the adrenal glands that sit on top of the kidneys. The adrenal glands are a 2-in-1 gland because they contain both a medulla as well as a cortex, and they do two completely different things. The medulla and the cortex are basically like your 2-in-1 gland because they have two different roles, even though it's all wrapped up in that one particular gland. The pancreas is also going to be in a dual system. So you have the pancreas within the digestive system and the pancreas within the endocrine system. On the endocrine side, we'll be talking about the hormones insulin and glucagon, although the exocrine portion or the digestive portion is much, much higher in the pancreas. The insulin and the glucagon regulation is still incredibly important. So we will go through that and make sure you understand how those things work. On the right side of the picture, what you see is organs with secondary endocrine functions. So you can see there the heart, the thymus, adipose, digestive, kidneys, gonads. On each one of those, if you look over to the right-hand side of the box, you'll see what chapter that information is going to be contained in. Because this is all going to be in other chapters, I'm going to wait until we get to those chapters to go into those hormones in detail. The only one that does not have a chapter associated with it is the adipose tissue for that leptin hormone, which is why I have the little star, star, star there. So you can go ahead and write in some notes in relation to the adipose tissue and the hormones that are going to come from that area, because we don't have a chapter that we're going to talk about this in later on. So right outside of that leptin, just write a little note to yourself that leptin is the hormone that signals to your brain that you are full. Okay, it is that hormone that indicates what we call satiety. That means that you are satisfied, you have eaten enough, and you do not need to continue to eat. So, whenever your body has received enough, the leptin should be the signal to your brain to not continue to eat so that you do not overeat. There is an antagonist to leptin. An antagonist means that it works counterintuitive to. The ghrelin, Ghrelin, again Ghrelin, is a hormone. It's produced mainly in the stomach, but ghrelin is the hormone that says, I am hungry. So think about ghrelin as grrr, like if your stomach growls and it's like grrr, and it's telling you that you really want to eat, that is ghrelin. So released mainly by the stomach, a little bit will come from the small intestine, the pancreas, maybe the brain. But if you have too much ghrelin signaling going on and that leptin signaling isn't working appropriately, it can lead you to overeat. So now why is this important for our patients? Because remember, we're not just learning anatomy so that you can pass a test, make a good grade, and move on. You're learning this so that you can help people. Help your friends, help your family, help your patients. So really utilize the information and roll with it and start putting it into practice as you learn it. Here's a good way to start putting it into practice. If you look at this website here, this website is an article that talks about what digested wheat gluten does to leptin and its receptors. This is incredibly important because we are having massive obesity epidemics in people, and I have worked with plenty of patients who have said to me, look, I want to lose the weight, but I am always hungry. I always feel like I need something to eat, and if I can't stop eating because the signal doesn't ever stop telling me that I need to eat, I need to eat, I need to eat, then I don't know what to do. So this is how we use physiology to help our patients. This article describes how digested wheat gluten inhibits the binding of the leptin to the leptin receptor. So remember, we just learned the importance of the receptor. If the hormone cannot dock on the receptor, the message cannot be read. If the message from leptin is, you are full and you do not need to continue to eat, if that message isn't being received by the brain, that patient is always going to feel hungry. So what do we have to do? we have to upregulate leptin receptors. And the way we do that is to remove the grains from the patient's diet. Because as you can see here, it's that wheat gluten. And in clinical practice, what I have found is instead of just removing gluten and putting them on all gluten-free stuff, which is usually more expensive and actually will dysregulate blood sugar at a really high level because of all of the different flours that they use. Total different story for another time. But removing all the grains, all of the wheat, the corn, the barley, the rye, just taking everything out will help with not having their signals so high that their receptors downregulate. So we have to remove this stuff from their diet, and a grain-free diet is often one of the best steps for a person who is struggling with their weight. And very often, it's surprising to me still to this day how much I hear patients say, oh, I thought I was eating healthy because I eat wheat bread on my sandwiches and I eat wheat thins as a snack, and they just list all of these wheat things that they're eating, and they think that they're eating healthy because of all of the misinformation that's out there, when unfortunately they're actually not eating healthy at all. So it's important that we learn what true health is, how it is achieved, and that's a lot of the stuff that we're going to be talking through this semester so that you can help as many people as possible. So making sure that we can upregulate those leptin receptors so the signal can be sent, you are full, you can stop eating now, often comes by getting people away from the things that are actually causing the receptors to downregulate, and grains are a huge part of that. Okay, so back to the definition of a hormone. If you cannot recite that definition, I encourage you to pause right here, go back and reread. You should be able to completely recite the definition, make sure that you completely understand what it's doing. In regards to, if somebody were to ask you, what is a hormone? You should be able to tell them exactly what it is. There are 3 different classes of hormones. So we have amino acid derivatives. We all know that amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. So again, vitally important that we're eating healthy proteins. Peptide hormones are basically chains of amino acids. So again, you have to eat healthy proteins. And lipid derivatives are those hormones that come from fats. So yes, fats are necessary. And I'll talk about how important some fats are in order to maintain good homeostasis within the endocrine system here in a few slides. This picture I am going to use to talk about the 3 different classes of hormones. Again, for words people, there are slides that go into more detail after this for those of you who need to read the words. Again, if you are a picture person and you understand everything that I'm saying with this picture, then you are good to go. Let's start with the amino acid derivatives. So we have derivatives of tyrosine, which include the thyroid hormones and catecholamines. If you look at the sources of tyrosine, that's going to include meat, dairy, and fish. If you're not getting those inside of your diet, it is possible for you to be low on tyrosine. And if you, let's say, maybe have a thyroid imbalance, it's very important that you understand how high quality foods can positively impact your health in maintaining homeostasis. If you're eating meat, dairy, and fish that's all really cheap, low quality, farm-raised fish, non-organic meats, non-organic dairy, then you are probably going to be struggling with some things that other people aren't who eat higher quality foods. I'll get more into that in just a little bit. Derivative of tryptophan is going to be melatonin, and so that real-world example is going to be thinking about turkey and Thanksgiving Day. So whenever you eat the turkey and you get really sleepy, that's because the tryptophan will help create the melatonin. Before melatonin, the chemical conversion is actually going to be serotonin. So there is a step in there. I won't make you go into the biochemical side of it, but there's a step in there where serotonin has to come first. So if you're not sleeping well at night and you have depression, then there could be some issues with your tryptophan levels not being able to create these hormones. So that is definitely another reason why we want to eat good, healthy foods to support all body systems. Some people will take melatonin as a supplement, but anytime you take something exogenously, that is just that single piece, exogenous supplementation can sometimes, because hormones work on a negative feedback system, lead to a decreased production endogenously. So some people may actually be shooting themselves in the foot by taking melatonin in a pill form. For some people it works really well, for other people not so much. Some people it may work well for a couple of months and then they notice that they're right back in the same position. And that's probably because your endogenous has actually decreased because of your exogenous use. So what you want to do is really pay attention to, what am I eating throughout the day? You should be nourishing your body with all the different colors of the rainbow in regards to produce, and then high quality proteins. And obviously drinking lots and lots of water. We'll talk about water multiple times throughout this semester. So for your tryptophan, you can see there that other sources include chocolate. So some people are like, I gotta have my chocolate, I need my chocolate. It's because, again, before that melatonin, you get the serotonin. So chocolate makes them happy. Oats, banana, dates, milk, cottage cheese, and peanuts. Now I know that peanuts are, a big no-no in a lot of people's world. I'm not really a big fan of peanuts, so if you can get your tryptophan from other sources, then by all means do it. Peanuts are usually pretty moldy, so they're definitely not my preference for foods for anybody. Peptide hormones. You can see here your peptide hormones are divided into two different groups. You have a glycoprotein group and a short polypeptide small protein group. So in your glycoprotein group, this is going to be things like TSH, LH, and FSH, whereas in your small protein group, these are going to be things like ADH, OXT, growth hormone, prolactin. So it really just depends upon how long or short the chain is in regards to what gets grouped where. Again, have to have those healthy proteins for those good amino acids, because as you can see, the glycoproteins are more than 200 amino acids long. So you've got to have those things within your body. And then the third class, the lipid derivatives. So this is going to be our hormones that are dependent upon good quality fats. We have the eicosanoids, which are going to be things like the leukotrienes and the prostaglandins, and the steroid hormones. The steroid hormones are going to be things that you think about whenever people complain about things like PMS or infertility or erectile dysfunction, because those are your progesterone, estrogen, testosterone hormones. When I am working with patients, one of my very favorite things to do is help women who are struggling with infertility. Either they cannot conceive, or they will conceive but they cannot carry to full term and they are miscarrying. So I really, really, really love to be able to come in and help women with proper nutrition in order to get their bodies to the point of homeostasis where they can conceive and they can carry to full term. It's absolutely miraculous to see these things happen. What has to be understood first is that if we're having a problem with steroid hormones, we have to look at what is going on with the levels of cholesterol. So although people think cholesterol is of the devil and it's terrible and we need it to be as low as possible, that's actually not true. That is dogma. So you cannot follow dogma, and in my class you will learn how to do your own research, how to think with your own brain, and how to realize that not everything that you hear is accurate. Some things are said in order to sell things and make more money. So we're going to learn true physiology and how things actually work. You do have to have cholesterol in order to have these steroid hormones be made in their forms that they are supposed to be made in. So we'll look at cholesterol in a few slides, and you'll see every single hormone that is going to be dependent upon having that cholesterol as a precursor. So words people here's your word slides for the different classes of the hormones that I just explained in the previous picture. Okay, so let's pause right here for the steroid hormones. Because these are derived from cholesterol, you have to throw away your crappy cooking oils. Yes, I know that that's a wonderful medical term. That's one of my favorite words, though. Crappy cooking oils have got to go. Those are going to be things like vegetable oil, canola oil, soy oil, peanut oil. Those things are not going to really help nourish your cellular membranes. If you remember from biology, every cell in your body is surrounded by a phospholipid bilayer. That phospholipid bilayer is going to have cholesterol embedded in every single cellular membrane. You have about 70 trillion cells inside of your body, so that means that cholesterol in this phospholipid bilayer is incredibly important. If you are eating things that are going to cause that phospholipid bilayer to malfunction, then your cells are not going to be healthy. And the only way that we achieve true health is on a cellular level. So we have to get down to health on a cellular level, and it's vitally important to understand that every single cell has to have a healthy cell membrane in order for it to do its job. A healthy cell membrane is fluid. It allows things to come in, like the vital nutrients. It allows waste to go out. But if you start tearing down that membrane, or even worse, if you start hardening it, which is what happens with trans fats, by the way, so if you're eating lots of foods that come in a package or in a box, even if it says 0 trans fats, there are loopholes around that, and it probably is not 0 trans fats, because trans fats are found in processed foods. So you do want to be very cautious with that. Your trans fats will harden those cellular membranes kind of like cement. And so that will not allow good healthy things to come in and bad stuff to go out. And if you cannot do that, then the cell will die. And if the cell dies, then you start becoming unhealthy, because the only way to maintain your health is if the cells function as they are supposed to, since ultimately they are the smallest living units and they make up every part of us. So get the cooking oils that are healthy and beneficial, such as coconut oil. That's my absolute favorite. I will talk about that this entire semester and all of the wonderful benefits of coconut oil. For those of you who are already thinking, wait, I heard that coconut oil is saturated fat. Saturated fat is not good for you. Let me just say that, again, you cannot believe everything that you hear. Yes, it is grouped into the saturated fat category because of its molecular makeup. It is solid when it is cold. It is liquid whenever it is warm. However, looking at the makeup of the coconut oil, it is made with medium chain triglycerides, which are incredibly beneficial for you. And they do not act like the saturated fat that you may get from something like a really poor quality steak. So, very important to understand the difference in that. Coconut oil is great. The other good oils are going to be things like avocado oil or almond oil, grapeseed oil. Olive oil is good. Just don't cook with extra virgin olive oil, because extra virgin olive oil is way too delicate to heat. It will go rancid very fast, and therefore it will negatively affect your cells once it burns. So that's just to be used for things like salad dressings, or maybe if you drizzle it on top of some salmon after you're done cooking it, things of that nature. It's not supposed to be heated. So get your good cooking oils, throw away those crap ones so that you can start nourishing your cells. Vitally important for anybody with hormonal imbalance to at least start there, because no matter what prescription or supplements you may be taking, if you're eating crappy cooking oils, you're basically going to be working against yourself. When we're looking at steroid hormones, again, these include the things like the estrogen, progesterone, testosterone. It includes other things as well. If you look at this particular picture, you can see here the cholesterol up at the top. And so this is the precursor to 5 different classes of steroid hormones. without going into great detail in biochemistry, what I really want you to focus your eyes on is the fact that the cholesterol shape is made up of 4 different structures. So I want you to put your eyes on those 4 different structures, and of course there's side chains that come off, but if you look down at all of these different hormones, you'll see those exact same 4 structures and the exact same pattern. Of course, the difference is going to be the side chain, so that's going to make it a different hormone. But you have the exact same 4 structures on all of these different hormones. That's why you have to have cholesterol in order to make these guys. If you know anybody who's on statin drugs are cholesterol lowering drugs, then you may be aware that one of the side effects of statin drugs is erectile dysfunction. And the reason why is as you lower and lower and lower a person's cholesterol level, that also means that you don't have that precursor anymore for testosterone. So men who take statin drugs don't always talk about it, but very often suffer with these things, and then they try to go to the low T clinics and get themselves some exogenous testosterone. And again, I already talked about the exogenous process of taking hormones. So we want to start with physiology. What happens physiologically inside of a person's body? If cholesterol levels become way too high, then we need to ask the question, why? Instead of just, let's lower it down. Because although cholesterol has been implicated with an increased risk of heart attack and stroke, if you go look at the research and you use your own brain, what you will find is 50% of people who die from heart attacks and strokes have high cholesterol. 50% of people who die from heart attacks and strokes have normal cholesterol. So there is no conclusive evidence that is going to show that by lowering your cholesterol levels, you're going to actually lower your risk for your heart attack or stroke. Unfortunately, statin drugs have the horrible NNT, and NNT means a number needed to treat. NNT for cholesterol is so bad that basically what it means is 100 people would have to take the drug in order for one person to experience any sort of benefit from the drug. So that means 99 people are going to suffer with the negative side effects in order to potentially help one person. So number needed to treat is really bad on statin drugs. They are an amazing moneymaker though. So I will not get on my soapbox on that. We will just continue to move on, and suffice it to say that beyond the need for making hormones, you also need cholesterol for other things, including digestive functions. So we'll be talking about that more throughout the semester as well. Transport and inactivation of hormones. We're talking about the ability to move them from different parts of the body through the bloodstream. Hormones can circulate freely, or they may travel through the bloodstream bound to special carrier proteins. So again, we have those carrier proteins that may be needed to help move the hormones into a different part of the body. If the hormone is free and it's not attached, it usually will remain functional a little less than an hour, and then it becomes inactivated if it diffuses out of the bloodstream and binds to the receptors on the target cells, or if it gets absorbed or broken down by the liver, kidneys, enzymes, etc. Whenever you get blood work done, it's important to get levels of free hormones as well as your total hormone levels. So if you've ever done a blood panel, let's just take thyroid for example, you can get total T3, but you can also get free T3. You can get total T4, but you can also get free T4. And there's a free hormone hypothesis that states the biological activity of a given hormone is affected by its free portion rather than the protein portion. So I put a little link there for a PubMed article. If you're interested in that, you can go in and you can read that. The free versus bound concentration activity really depends upon the hormone involved. So it's variable depending upon whether or not you're talking about hormones from the thyroid or, let's say, hormones from a different organ. When we're looking at the thyroid and the steroid hormones, just keep in mind these remain functional much longer. Majority of them are attached to those special transport proteins, but there will always be an equilibrium state that has to exist between what's free and biologically active and what's bound. So the bloodstream will always contain a substantial reserve of those bound hormones, which again is why whenever you do your blood work, you want to get both total and free, so that way you can kind of see what's going on in those particular areas. If the hormone binds, it has the ability to do these three things. It can either alter the genetic activity, so genes, we're talking about DNA and that double helix and the coding for what should happen inside of your system. It can alter the rate of protein synthesis, or it can change membrane permeability, which of course we just talked about how important the plasma membrane is to every single cell in your body. So I put the little star after alter genetic activity to ask you the question, what would this mean if you only eat animal protein with high hormone dosing in order for that company to have higher profit margins? If you are eating the 99-cent chicken breast that has been pumped full of hormones so that it can grow faster and fatter, so that there can be a greater amount to sell quicker and therefore increase the company's profit, you have to understand that those hormones that are in that meat are then going to go into you. And it can go in and it can alter the genetic activity. This is why there are documentaries that are made about how terrible animal protein can actually be for your health. Again, this is why you need to know the difference in the 99-cent chicken breast versus those that are $6.99 because they're organic. When you're at the store, if you compare the 99-cent to the $6.99, you're comparing apples to oranges and you're not getting the full picture. So in comparing the two prices, it may look like, oh, I'd be better off buying the 99 cents because that's going to save me money, when in fact that 99 cents a pound could lead to things that alter your genetic activity, and by altering that DNA or that RNA, however it's expressed, and then therefore may potentially lead to some cancer issues. Now you may have a massive chemotherapy bill, radiation bill, surgical bill on your hands because you chose something that you thought would save you money, when in fact it costs you way more money later on down the road. The $6.99, we don't have those hormones. Those things aren't going to be able to come in and negatively affect you. It's not going to be the same. So whenever you hear documentaries saying, oh, all burgers are bad and everybody should be eating the Impossible Burger because it's all made from plants, I highly caution you to really dig in and think and do your research before you just go off the deep end and like, yep, I'm just gonna, go eat the Impossible Burger, because I could say some negative things about the Impossible Burger as well. So plants are great. Yes, you should eat plants. You should eat plants, however, that grow naturally from the ground, not ones that are manipulated inside of a lab. Animal protein is great. Your body needs those proteins. It's very important, but you should not be eating things that are massively produced at a very cheap state, because that's not going to be healthy for you. You want to get to know your local farmers and then go to the farmer's market or go to places that are going to have higher quality meats that are a whole lot healthier with animals that are humanely raised. So keep that in mind as you talk to your friends and family whom you love whenever you see them making choices by comparing apples to oranges. Catecholamines and peptide hormones are not lipid soluble. That means they do not have the ability to penetrate that plasma membrane, so therefore they will have to rely on extracellular receptors in order to get that hormone to be read so that the signal can be utilized properly. However, steroid and thyroid hormones are lipid soluble, and they do have the ability to diffuse across the plasma membrane and then therefore bind to the intracellular receptors. When you have a hormone that has to bind to an extracellular membrane, because it cannot get inside of the cell, we're going to call that specific hormone that binds to the extracellular receptor the first messenger. That first messenger, when it binds and docks on that extracellular receptor, is going to promote the release of a second messenger to go inside of the cell. That second messenger is known as an intermediary molecule, and it can act as an enzyme activator or inhibitor or even a cofactor, but ultimately it's going to change the metabolic reactions within the cell. Some examples of these second messengers would be CAMP, CGMP, and calcium. When that happens and you have the intermediary molecules going in and modifying the metabolic activity within the cell, it is possible to have this process that we call amplification. So the amplification means you have a small number of hormones that bind to the extracellular receptors, but because of the release of the second messengers, you could have thousands of those that may appear, and therefore it will magnify the effect of those hormones on that target cell. So we call that amplification. The arrival of a single hormone can promote the release of more than one type of second messenger, or the production of a linked sequence of enzymatic reactions known as a receptor cascade. So through these mechanisms, the hormones can alter a lot of aspects of the cell function all at the same time. So by using second messengers, we can have amplification or we can have receptor cascades. I'm going to use this picture to kind of give you the big forest picture understanding of what's happening with the first and second messengers. Again, for words people, there are word slides after this that you can utilize in order to read them if the verbal learning is best for you. So, if we look at the top right of the page, what you can see there, the first messenger, that hormone that cannot get inside of the cell, it will bind to that extracellular receptor. So what you see in the reddish orangish color, that is your phospholipid bilayer. And you can see that protein receptor in blue. You see how the shape of the hormone fits the protein receptor perfectly. So the shape has to line up. The hormone and the receptor is like a lock and key mechanism. If the shapes don't line up, they're not going to lock together, and therefore the key is not going to turn, the message is not going to be read. So, whenever that lock and key mechanism happens, that G protein can become activated. The G protein is an enzyme complex that is attached to that membrane receptor that will serve as the link between the first and the second messenger. So, if we have the G proteins activated, they can then make an effect on your second messengers. So look at the picture labeled A, effects on CAMP level. We've got the hormone docking to the extracellular receptor. It activated the G protein, and now once that G protein is activated, now we've got our second messenger CAMP. It can open ion channels or it can activate enzymes, which can then change the metabolic activity within the cell. Some of the first messenger examples you'll see underneath that, epi, norepi, calcitonin, parathyroid, and a whole bunch of other different hormones have the ability to do this. If you look at B, what you can see is calcium is now being utilized in the example. So instead of using the CAMP as the second messenger, calcium can be used in order to have an effect on the cell membrane, but it still works in the same way. The hormone docks to the extracellular receptor, activates the G protein, and allows calcium to come in because that G protein will open that calcium channel. So then calcium can act as the second messenger, and activate various enzymes in order to change metabolic activity within the cell. If you feel comfortable with understanding that we have a hormone that cannot get inside of the cell, so therefore it has to dock on the extracellular receptor and activate a G protein so that intermediary molecules, second messengers, can get inside of the cell and change the metabolic activity, then you get it. You're good. 80% of prescription drugs are going to target receptors that are coupled to G proteins. So whenever you're looking at this process of amplification or these receptor cascades, that's why drugs can make the changes that they make quickly, because they're targeting these G proteins, and then therefore we can get amplification, which changes the metabolic activity within the cell at a much higher rate. Okay, so those were other word slides that explain more for that picture. If we're looking at steroid hormones, just know that they can alter the rate of DNA transcription in the nucleus. Again, steroid hormones include things like estrogen and progesterone. Animals can be given steroid hormones in order to make them fatter quicker. Again, those steroid hormones can alter DNA. Thyroid hormones can bind to receptors either within the nucleus or on the mitochondria. If they're doing things on the mitochondria, then that can then affect ATP. I'm sure everybody remembers that ATP is the powerhouse of the cell, right? And we're going to be talking about cellular energy. So let's look at two examples that show this in pictures. Steroid hormones, again, lipid soluble, they can diffuse through that membrane and get to receptors that are either in the cytoplasm or within the nucleus, and therefore it can make changes. Thyroid hormones do the same. So they get into the cell. They do not need to dock on an extracellular receptor. They can come in and they can get into the nucleus in order to change things that are going on with genes, or again, they can go to that mitochondria in order to help increase ATP production. So let's make it make sense. Clinically, if you have a patient who has hypothyroidism, hypo means too low, thyroidism, obviously thyroid. Hypothyroidism means they are not having their thyroid working adequately. It is too slow. So very often one of the things that they will complain about is fatigue. They will say they are tired. And this is why they are tired, because if those hormones are not binding to that mitochondrial receptor in order to increase ATP production, their energy levels are going to be low, because we have to have that cellular energy to function efficiently. So think about it from an actual clinical standpoint to make it make sense to you. We have to have the hormones, they have to dock on the receptors in order to get the response that we need. This is why true health is found on a cellular level. It does not matter what you look like on the outside. What matters is what's happening on the inside. And if things on the inside are not working appropriately, then the diagnoses are coming. So again, hormone secretion controlled mainly by negative feedback. Negative feedback, because once we get to the level where we need to be, we don't need to continue to produce more and more and more and more hormones. If we do that, if we continue to go beyond, then remember that's called positive feedback. So some hormones are going to be on a positive feedback side, such as those that are associated with the labor and delivery process, but most of them are going to be controlled by negative feedback. This can be triggered by a number of different things. Humoral stimuli, think about that as the extracellular fluid. This can control hormone secretion by heart, pancreas, parathyroid gland, digestive tract, or it can be triggered by hormonal stimuli, so either the arrival or the removal of a hormone, or neural stimuli, so neurotransmitters. Remember, hypothalamus is king, and he provides the highest level of endocrine control because he releases what are called regulatory hormones, which tells the pituitary gland what to do. Again, we'll get into that more in Part B. So when a cell receives instructions from two hormones at the same time, you can get 4 possible outcomes. Antagonistic effect means the result really depends upon the balance between the two hormones. For instance, parathyroid and calcitonin. Those two have an antagonistic effect. One wants to lower blood calcium, the other wants to raise blood calcium. So, whenever we get into those hormones, you'll understand which does which and how they are antagonistic to one another. A synergistic effect, obviously we all know what synergy means, so this is an additive effect. It's a boosting. Permissive effect means one hormone is needed for another to produce an effect, and then an integrative effect is hormones will produce different but complementary results. As we go through and we talk about all of the different hormones and their roles on their target cells, you'll start to see how different hormones can cause these different effects. Part B. On this picture, what you can see is we have the hypothalamus connected to the pituitary via the infundibulum. So Part B, we're going to start off by talking about the hypothalamus and the pituitary and their role in the endocrine system, because it is a major role. The hypothalamus is the king because he says what gets to happen with what's going on in the pituitary gland. He does that through the regulatory hormones. So the regulatory hormones are signals that basically will tell the pituitary gland, I want you to release this, or I want you to stop releasing this. In addition to the regulatory hormones, the hypothalamus will also make ADH and oxytocin, and then will transport them to the posterior pituitary gland for release. The hypothalamus also contains some autonomic centers. So remember, autonomic, that is going to be your PNS and your SNS, your parasympathetic nervous system and your sympathetic nervous system. That is what is going to also control your adrenal medulla. What you're going to see is that the adrenal medulla does not have dual innervation. So although the autonomic centers are usually going to give dual innervation to most organs, the adrenal medulla only has information coming from the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, so here is a picture of the hypothalamus, and look at the very top of the picture where you can see the green box, the purplish box, and the pinkish box. So on the very first box, what you can see is production of ADH and OXT. The hypothalamus is the one that is actually synthesizing these two hormones. So make sure that you take note, those two hormones are produced in the king, in the master gland, the hypothalamus. It also does the secretion of the regulatory hormones. Again, these are going to help control what's happening within the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, our queen. So the hypothalamus will give the signal and the queen will follow through on the signal. The RH and the IH that you see above are going to stand for releasing hormone and inhibitory hormone. So if the hypothalamus says RH, then the pituitary gland knows to release that hormone. If it says IH, then the pituitary gland knows stop releasing that hormone. So that's how the regulatory hormones will work. Then the last box, control of sympathetic. So circle the word, sympathetic output to the adrenal medulla. Sympathetic only. There is no dual innervation. There is not parasympathetic. So that sympathetic output will go down to the adrenal medulla, which is the middle portion of the adrenal gland, and then allow for the release of epi and norepi from the adrenal medulla. If you're looking at the first box again for the ADH and the OXT, follow it down, and what you will see as you follow those green lines down is that it ends up in the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. So although the ADH and the OXT are made in the hypothalamus, they're actually going to be transported into the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland in order to be released when needed. The posterior lobe of the pituitary gland is only going to do the ADH and the OXT. The anterior lobe does other hormones completely different. So make sure you keep those two lobes separate, because sometimes the test questions can get a little bit tricky if you don't read anterior lobe, posterior lobe, production, release, etc. Okay? Whenever we're looking at those releasing hormones, again, this means that we are going to tell the anterior lobe of the pituitary to stimulate the synthesis and secretion of something within that anterior lobe. Inhibiting hormones means do not make it nor secrete it. Again, this is all based upon negative feedback. So the hypothalamus will receive signal from other parts of the body saying either we have enough or we don't have enough. If we have enough, then it's going to release the IH, and it's going to say, hey, pituitary gland, we got enough, so you do not need to keep doing this work. If the signal is sent to the hypothalamus to say we don't have enough and we need more, then that's whenever the releasing hormone will be sent out in order to tell the anterior pituitary gland, we need this in the body, please make this and release this. So let's look at this picture. Whenever you are looking at this picture, your key at the top, the red arrow is stimulation and the blue arrow is inhibition. On the very first row, you can see releasing hormone RH, you see TRH, CRH, and GnRH. So that is going to be your thyroid releasing hormone, corticotropin releasing hormone, and gonadotropin releasing hormone. If you ever see anything on the exams in this class, nursing exams, any type of exam, if you see the RH, then you need to automatically tell yourself this hormone comes from the hypothalamus. If you see the IH, you need to automatically tell yourself this hormone comes from the hypothalamus. Okay? Now, the hypothalamus tells which part of the pituitary gland what to do. The anterior part. So it is the anterior portion that will get the signal either from the RH or the IH hormones. Whenever the TRH is released, that is the signal that says we need to stimulate the thyroid gland. So thyroid releasing hormone comes from the hypothalamus, goes into the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, and stimulates TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone. That TSH then knows I need to go stimulate the thyroid. So it will leave the anterior pituitary gland in order to go to the thyroid gland and stimulate it. When it stimulates it, that is the signal for the thyroid gland to make thyroid hormones. Okay? Same thing in other areas of the body. So let's look at the CRH. CRH comes from the hypothalamus. The signal is corticotropin releasing hormone is needed. I'm going to send the CRH down to the anterior lobe of the pituitary, is what the hypothalamus says. Once it's in the anterior lobe, it's read, and that anterior lobe of the pituitary says, okay, you want corticotropin releasing. All right, so I'm going to make ACTH. That is adrenocorticotropin hormone. That is going to then go down to the adrenal cortex. Because again, that AC, adrenocortico. So we're going to the adrenal cortex. Remember, your adrenals are the 2-in-1 glands. You have a cortex, you have a medulla. ACTH is not going to go to the medulla. ACTH is adrenocorticotropic hormone, so it's going to the adrenal cortex. And when it gets to the adrenal cortex, it is the signal that says, adrenal cortex, I need you to release some hormones. So glucocorticoids can then be released. Last example, Gnrh, gonadotropin releasing hormone. So gonads. We're thinking of the gonads, we want to think of the testes, and we want to think of the ovaries. Gnrh is the signal from the hypothalamus that the anterior lobe needs to secrete the FSH, the follicle stimulating hormone, and the LH, the luteinizing hormone. FSH can go to testes or ovaries, depending on if you're male or female, and then depending again if you're male or female will determine what actually happens within the testes or the ovaries. And then the same thing for the LH. Testes, ovaries, depending upon what sex you are, will depend upon what is the signal that is going to be read. We will get into those things more whenever we get into the reproductive system. So we'll go into a whole lot deeper detail in talking about what's going to happen within the testes and the ovaries when they are stimulated by FSH or LH. If we have enough, let's go back to our first example where TRH was released. It got sent over to the anterior lobe, which is the signal to make TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone. That's the signal to go stimulate the thyroid gland and make thyroid hormones out of the thyroid gland. Once there are enough thyroid hormones, then the signal will be sent back up to the hypothalamus. So that's where you have your blue line at the end of the picture. Once there's enough, negative feedback says, all right, I'm going to send the signal that we have enough thyroid hormones. We don't want to keep pumping them out, because if we continue to pump them out, then that person can go over into hyperthyroidism. So the goal is always homeostasis in physiology. So negative feedback says, I've got enough, let me send the signal so there is no further production right now, because we're good with where we're at, we're balanced. That's the goal. So let's talk about this pituitary gland, also known as the hypophysis. This lies within the sella turcica of the brain. This is going to basically isolate the pituitary gland from the cranial cavity. So if you remember from 2401, it's basically that little ball that hangs off of the infundibulum, which is attached to that hypothalamus. This is divided again into an anterior and posterior lobe. Very important to note that we have 9 hormones that are going to come from the gland in total, but not all 9 come from the same location. So on the next page you'll see the key, and you'll want to make sure that you pay attention to the key, because there's a color difference, 3 different colors that will show you which hormones come from anterior, which come from posterior, and then we have one little section that we have not yet talked about, which is right in the middle. So let's look at those. These are going to bind to the extracellular receptors, and they will use that CAMP as second messenger in order to help maintain homeostasis. All right, so look at your key. You have purple in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 hormones. Then you have that grayish color for the MSH, and then you have the teal color for the ADH and the OXT. Now that grayish color for MSH is that middle portion. However, a lot of books will group this into anterior lobe. Some won't even distinguish the difference. Our book tells you what that portion of that middle anterior, or that middle pituitary gland is called. But it kind of gets grouped into the anterior lobe section. It is not a section all by itself. So just keep that in mind. There is no anterior, middle, posterior. It's just anterior, posterior. Look at the box at the top that says the hypothalamus. So again, the hypothalamus is our king, and it will release those regulatory hormones. Regulatory hormones are going to be released into what we call the hypophyseal portal system. And I'll show you a picture of the hypophyseal portal system on another slide. The hypophyseal portal system is going to be the way that these hormones get transferred from the hypothalamus down into the anterior lobe of the pituitary. But this picture is great because it basically will show you if ACTH is released from the pituitary, then it's going to the adrenal gland. If TSH is released, it's going to the thyroid gland. GH, it'll go to the liver and then also onto bone, muscle, other tissues. So this is really good if you like pictures, so you can just kind of get a very detailed sequence of where does it come from and what is it called, and then where does it go, and once it gets to that target tissue, what is it going to release. So once the ACTH gets to the adrenal, not the medulla, the adrenal cortex, then it's going to release those glucocorticoids. Remember, the medulla is only under the control of the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is going to be utilizing epinephrine and norepinephrine. So keep the medulla and the cortex separate from one another. On your growth hormone, the GH, I have a little circle there that says this is why exercise and sleep is important. Growth hormone is released whenever you are exercising intensely. It will not be released if you're doing a light walk. It will not be released if you're doing yoga. It is released when you are doing high intensity interval training, the HIIT. If you are not familiar with HIIT, I definitely encourage you to look that up. But I am going to have you guys do a paper on growth hormone so that way you can understand it a little bit better, because a lot of people have a lot of misinformation about growth hormone. And again, we're going to learn true physiology. We're not going to subscribe to dogma. So you may see some things that you once thought were true actually turn into, oh wow, I didn't even realize that that's how it was, as you go through and learn more about growth hormone. But it will be released during high intensity interval training as well as during sleep. This is why sleep is so incredibly important. It's best to get to bed by 10:30 p.m. so that you can be in stage 4 sleep by midnight. If you're not there by midnight, you're not going to be releasing sufficient levels of growth hormone, and growth hormone is like an anti-inflammatory, anti-aging hormone. It's incredibly beneficial. You know, the older people get, the more they say, oh, I need my beauty sleep, because sleep is going to help with beauty because of the release of the growth hormone at night. But if you're not going to bed until 1, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, you're missing it, you're not going to get it, and you are cellularly going to age faster than you should. So I hope that you enjoy that exercise or that little article over the growth hormone so that you can learn more about it and talk more about it with those that you love. So let's just look at an example here in regards to looking at PIH versus PRH. So we kind of did this a little bit already in one of the previous slides where we looked at signals sent from the hypothalamus down to the anterior lobe, but you only got to see the RH side of that. Remember, if you see RH or if you see IH, you need to tell yourself that hormone is coming from the hypothalamus. In this particular case, we're talking about prolactin. So if we have the PRH, prolactin releasing hormone, it will tell the anterior lobe to stimulate, secrete the prolactin, PRL. PRL gets released from the anterior lobe and goes down to stimulate the mammary gland. Prolactin is going to not just be secreted when someone is nursing or breastfeeding, but prolactin is going to constantly be going on throughout a woman's cycle. Too much prolactin can lead to a woman feeling like she has sore and tender breasts. If you have around your cycle time breast swelling and breast tenderness, then there is a problem with your prolactin levels. What should happen is if you have too much, then the inhibitory signal should be sent so that we can shut off the PRH. And instead, we would turn on the PIH so that no further prolactin is being released. So things that are associated with PMS, whether it be mood swings or whether it be cravings, intense bloating, lots of pain, breast swelling, breast tenderness, all of those things, although they may be common, they are not normal. So let me be very clear, and I want you to write this down. Just because something is common does not make it normal. We are learning physiology. We are learning how things should occur inside of the body. When things do not occur as they are supposed to, it is called pathology. Okay, so there's a problem. If it's not normal physiology, it can be pathology. However, in America, we've gotten so far away from what's normal that just because something becomes common, now we frequently use the terms common and normal interchangeably, when in fact that is so incorrect. So it's very important for you to know that just because something happens frequently and it occurs in a lot of people, that makes it common, but that does not make it normal. So if you go to your doctor and you complain of something and they say, oh yeah, that's normal, make sure that you figure out, is it really, or is it just common? Okay, this is why we learn physiology, so that you know exactly what's supposed to happen, so that whenever someone dismisses you and says, no, you're fine, you can then go figure out what's going on and how can I fix it. Alright, so the previous slide showed just the hormones from the anterior lobe of the pituitary. This slide is more so focused on the hormones that are going to be released from the hypothalamus and come down to the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, that ADH and that OXT, and then you can see there where they're headed. So ADH stands for antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuresis means do not let go of water, hold on to water, do not pee so much, which is why it acts on the kidneys. And then the oxytocin is going to act on both males and females. So a lot of people think oxytocin is just for females whenever they have a baby, because it is the one that is going to help stimulate uterine contractions so that baby can be moved out of the uterus through the vagina and then out into the world. However, oxytocin also acts upon males as well. So you can see there that the hormone will stimulate the smooth muscle within the prostate gland. In the female, this is also going to be utilized at times other than labor and delivery. The oxytocin is the hormone that binds men and women when they have sex. So this is the hormone that stimulates the release of the chemicals that will help both partners enjoy the sex, because you get those contractions and it feels good. But it's also the reason why you don't just sleep with everybody, because it is a binding hormone. It is a hormone that creates emotional attachments, just as mothers become emotionally attached to their children whenever they give birth. So oxytocin is a wonderful hormone when it is something that is utilized in the respectful way that it should be between a husband and a wife. So again, don't sleep with everybody, because you don't want to bind yourself emotionally to everybody out there. Not a good thing. So here they are all together. You can see from the hypothalamus the three ways that it can control, whether it's direct control from the sympathetic nervous system to the adrenal medulla, whether it's regulatory control over that anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, or whether it's the direct release of hormones that are made inside of the hypothalamus, the ADH and the OXT, and just transported over to the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland so that they can be released whenever they're needed. So make sure that you mark this slide, really pay attention to this slide, because it's so full of information. You've got all of your patterns of where things are going, which is one of the most important things as you're learning the hormones, because people get confused over where did it come from, where is it going, and what is it supposed to do. It's all very systematic, and because things can kind of get a little bit wonky if you don't know your system, it can be hard to keep these things in order. So in order to help yourself kind of maintain the systematic flow in which the hormones are going to be released and where they're going and what they're going to do, highly encourage you to really take use and make notes on this particular picture. Okay, so for the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, the AKA to this is Adrenal Hypothesis. Obviously, in anatomy, there are tons of AKAs. So the Adrenal Hypothesis is the AKA for specifically the anterior lobe. This has three regions. The pars distalis, look at the picture, that's the big pink portion of the anterior lobe. The pars tuberalis, so if you go up near the infundibulum, you will see that around that stalk. And the pars intermedia. The pars intermedia is that area where we just previously saw that MSH being released. So technically this is going to be grouped in with the anterior lobe, even though it's an intermedia. The median eminence is a swelling near the attachment of the infundibulum. So find your hypothalamus in the picture, and then right under that you will see the median eminence. This is where the hypothalamic neurons will release those regulatory hormones into that hypophyseal portal system. So these are going to be fenestrated capillaries. Fenestra means window, so they're not really tightly enclosed capillaries. They have holes in them, or like little windows. This is what the hypophyseal portal system looks like. So again, you can see the hypothalamus, you can see the infundibulum, you can see the anterior lobe of the pituitary, you can see the pars intermedia, and then you can see the posterior lobe of the pituitary. On the anterior side of the pituitary, take note at how this is more glandular. In the lab, you will be looking at this underneath the microscope, and the anterior lobe has a more glandular appearance, whereas the posterior lobe is going to have more of a neural appearance. So whenever you see all of the green lines, basically what you're looking at, the green ones that are going down into the posterior lobe of the pituitary, are the neural connections. So that's one of the ways that you can distinguish in lab the difference between anterior lobe and posterior lobe, is just by looking at the appearance of the structure, and it will be pretty obvious to see the difference between the two. But these vessels, these portal vessels, are going to deliver the blood that contains the regulatory hormones down into the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. So, very important to see the major structural differences between the two. The portal vessels, again, is called the hypophyseal portal system. This ensures that the regulatory hormones will reach the cells in the anterior pituitary before going into the general circulation. So, as we get into the hormones of the anterior lobe, I've done all of this in blue, so that way you can know, see the blue, it's anterior. We've got the key, so you've already been able to see the full names of these hormones. Very often, though, their abbreviations are going to be used. So when you're in clinical practice, a lot of times people are not going to waste time saying adrenocorticotropic hormone. They're not going to do that. They're just going to say ACTH. So if checking ACTH levels, then you need to know what they're referencing. Okay? So when it comes to the gonadotropins, I've already said the gonads are the organs that will produce the gametes. Those are going to be the sex cells. So whether that's the sperm or the ovum, this is going to be coming from the testes or the ovaries, obviously whether it's sperm or ovum. Again, we're going to go into greater detail with these later on, so we're not going to worry so much about it right now. Just know that your Gnrh is coming from the hypothalamus, because it has that RH, and that is the signal to release the FSH and the LH from the anterior lobe of the pituitary to go down either into the testes or the ovaries. Growth hormone, again, you're going to do that paper on this, but this is going to stimulate liver cells to release somatomedins that will help stimulate tissue growth. Obviously, it's called growth hormone. Somatomedins will cause the skeletal muscle fibers and other cells to increase the uptake of amino acids. So if you are that person who loves exercise and you're hardcore exercise, then you already know in order to build skeletal muscle, you have to break down the fibers a little bit and then have really good high quality protein after your workout to help rebuild those things up. So that growth hormone that comes from that high intensity interval training is one of the best ways to not only build skeletal muscle but also to lose weight. Because if you have more muscle, you're going to have a higher basal metabolic rate and you're going to have a greater ability to make sure that your body is utilizing massive amounts of calories. Whenever I was in school, we all went through, when I was getting my doctorate, we all went through a day where we all got our fat percentage of our body tested as well as our BMR, our basal metabolic rate. Anybody who had lower levels of fat because they had higher levels of muscle would have a higher basal metabolic rate, which meant they could eat more and they were going to burn more simply by just sitting there. Without even exercising, they're going to burn more calories because they have higher levels of muscle fibers that are going to need to utilize more calories. So high intensity interval training by releasing that growth hormone will help stimulate that skeletal muscle fiber to help your muscles grow and to help your weight go down. All right, the other thing is we have breakdown of triglycerides in the adipocytes. So lipolysis, remember lysis means to cut or to separate or to break down. So we'll be using fats for energy instead of glucose. Again, this is why HIIT helps with weight loss, because it helps you to burn that fat off. And then breakdown of glycogen by liver cells causing a higher blood glucose. So that one might be a little bit confusing, but basically making sure that your body has the energy that it needs to continue to utilize and have proper cellular metabolism by those cells that are going to be needing to use the glucose. So we're going to break down glycogen, which is basically stored glucose. So we're not just going to keep glucose in storage. The more that we keep it in storage, the more likely that we are going to have more fat storage as well. So breaking that down and then utilizing it so that your body is constantly running through the things that you provide it for. Pars intermedia, again, this is going to be the portion that's right in that middle, but it's associated with the anterior lobe. It secretes the MSH, which will stimulate melanin production. So melanin production is going to be the thing that makes our skin a little bit darker. According to the textbook, it says it's non-functional in adults. However, there have been known to be functions of MSH outside of pregnant women and those with certain diseases. So this book is not completely up to date. I do encourage you to look that up. There is things that MSH can do other than the two that are listed right here. Posterior lobe of the pituitary gland is also called the Neuro Hypothesis. Again, remember you have those neural connections there, so just remember the ends go together. In the lab, you'll probably also hear the verbiage pars nervosa. So whether it's the Neuro Hypothesis or the nervosa, or the neural connection, remember all of the ends go together. And the end, Neuro Hypothesis, pars nervosa, neural connections, all of that is happening within the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. Remember, this is the one that will get the ADH and the oxytocin that is originally produced by the hypothalamus, and it will be called upon when needed. All right, so let's talk about the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is obviously in the neck, so a little bit below the thyroid cartilage of the larynx. So the larynx is the voice box. So slightly inferior to that, you should be able to easily palpate the thyroid gland in the neck. It's also easier to feel whenever you have someone swallow. So practice with people in trying to palpate the thyroid gland so that you can kind of get an idea of what it feels like. When we're looking at the thyroid gland, because this is such a huge ordeal for so many people, it's very important to understand how this works on a physiological level. Last year, so it's no longer this year, this is 2020, but last year, 2019, thyroid drug prescriptions surpassed heart drugs, which is huge because heart disease is still the #1 killer in our country. However, the prescriptions for thyroid drugs surpass the prescriptions for heart drugs, and these drugs unfortunately have been linked to an increase in breast cancer risk. As if there's already not enough breast cancer diagnoses, now whenever we look at the potential for taking a thyroid drug to increase another disease process, it's quite scary, and patients need to be aware of this. So I put in a little article for you right there, PubMed. You can go and read that yourself, and how the thyroid drugs are related to the increased breast cancer risk. On the very top there, I have throw away your blank toothpaste. Now, some of you are going to get upset from this, but we're learning true physiology and we're getting rid of dogma. Throw away your fluoride toothpaste. I know those of you who are going into dental hygiene are not going to be too happy to hear that, but you need to do your research on what fluoride does. Fluoride will compete with receptors with receptors in the thyroid for iodine, and you have to have iodine in order to make your thyroid work efficiently. Fluoride is a competitor. Remember, everything about hormone signals being read has to do with receptors. So if your receptors are messed up, then your hormone signals cannot be sent and homeostasis cannot be maintained. So fluoride can be very damaging to many parts of the body, but especially to the thyroid. So any patients who already even suspect that they may have some thyroid issues need to go to a more natural toothpaste, and they need to get rid of that fluoride. For me personally, for myself, as well as for my kids, we do not get the fluoride treatments at the dentist, and our dentist knows why, and our dentist is okay with that. Actually, one of my patients is my dental hygienist, and so she knows what I know about nutrition. So whenever I said, look, if we come and see you, do not put that fluoride in my mouth or in my kid's mouth, and she's fine with it. She understands, she gets it. So sometimes you just have to know your information, and then whenever you go talk to the people who treat you in various places where you can't treat yourself, like the dentist, they need to know that you know what you're talking about. So they never fight us on it. We don't have any issues. They completely understand. So that fluoride, look into that. Again, the thyroid lies inferior to the thyroid cartilage of the larynx. It has 2 lobes. Now the pituitary gland also has 2 lobes, and the pituitary is connected to the hypothalamus via the infundibulum. Do not get that confused with the 2 lobes of the thyroid that are connected by the isthmus. Since they both start with I, I've seen students get that confused, but just keep in mind it is the 2 lobes of the thyroid that are connected by the isthmus. The thyroid follicles are these little hollow spheres that are lined by cuboidal epithelium. When you look at this in the lab underneath the microscope, you are going to see circles surrounded by a layer of simple cuboidal tissue. It should be very easy for you to identify the thyroid gland because that circle that is surrounded by that cuboidal epithelium is quite obvious to see. The thyroid follicles will be surrounded by capillaries, and the cells will absorb iodide from the blood. The follicle cavity contains what we call a colloid, so it's very viscous, jelly-like material. But outside of the thyroid follicle, outside of that simple cuboidal epithelium, what you will see are these things called C cells or parafollicular cells. Remember, para means off to the side. So off to the side of the follicle, you will see the C cell. The C cell is important because there you will get a different hormone, whereas within the thyroid follicles, that's where you're going to get your thyroid hormones. So thyroglobulin is the protein that gets synthesized by the follicle cells and then secreted into that colloid of the follicle. This is what will contain that amino acid tyrosine that we need in order to help build thyroid hormones. So if you remember back to our 3 classes of hormones, we have those amino acid derivatives. Thyroid hormones are very dependent upon the tyrosine. So this is where you will get it in that follicle. Thyroid hormones include T4 and T3. T4 and T3, the difference is the number of iodine atoms. So obviously T4 has 4 and T3 has 3. And the way that I remember this in clinical practice as I'm looking over blood labs, whenever I look at the levels of total T4 and free T4 as well as total T3 and free T3, this is what I remember. T4, although there should be more of that, I think about that as firewood. Okay, so you may want to write that down, firewood. T3, I think about it as the fire. If I have a room full of wood, is it going to keep me warm if it just sits there? Absolutely not, right? It's just the starting block. I need a match to light it on fire in order for it to be functional and useful to me. If it's not going to be lit on fire, it's going to do absolutely nothing but take up space. So functionally, it's serving no purpose as it just sits there. If, however, a match lights it on fire, now I've got something that can heat and warm me. So T3 is the fire because it is the metabolically active hormone. So thyroxine, the T4, may be more abundant, and that's fine. We can have a whole lot of wood, but I need my wood to be on fire if it is going to work for me functionally. So wood versus fire. Remember that so that you can help your thyroid patients. Some people get on Synthroid prescriptions because that's what their doctor prescribes whenever they have abnormal blood work, and they say, here, take this Synthroid, it'll help you. And I've seen numerous, can't even count how many patients I've seen that will come to me and say, I got a Synthroid prescription, but it's actually making me worse. It's really not helping do anything at all, and I don't want to continue to take this prescription because I don't feel any better. The problem is the doctor just gave them a crap ton of wood. But if you can't convert your T4 into T3, which is going to happen in liver and kidneys, if you have any liver and kidney issues or congestion, then you're going to have problems with conversion. If you can't convert to the metabolically active form of T3, then the Synthroid, all you're going to get from it is the negative side effects that come from the drug. So this is how you help people. Help them to understand that there's a problem with the conversion, and we have to look at what's going on a biochemical level in order to get that T3 level up. Some people will switch over to prescription, especially like Armour Thyroid, which has both T4 and T3, and that seems to help them better since they cannot do the conversion. TBGs are thyroid binding globulins, so these are again proteins. If that thyroid patient is not eating healthy, they're not eating sufficient proteins because all they want to eat all day is carbohydrates, which is very common for thyroid patients because they crave sweets. Why do they crave sweets? Because their energy level is low, and they're craving glucose so that it will give them energy. But it's counterintuitive. It's actually not working. It's just making them heavier and more overweight and more problematic. So proteins have to be in this person's diet. They have to eat good proteins, and they have to stay away from those high carbs that are going to interfere with their homeostasis. TBGs will bind about 75% of T4 and 75% of T3. The rest of the thyroid hormones will be bound by other proteins, which are transthyretin and albumin. 0.3% of T3 and 0.03% of T4 will remain unbound and free to diffuse into the tissues. Again, different labs are going to say different things in regards to their levels. So even if somebody comes back as normal, I'm still looking at the labs with high scrutiny, because if they are quote unquote normal, but they're at the incredibly low end range of normal, as in 0.1 away, 0.2 away, that close, we're not going to call that normal. At that point now, it's subclinical. If you can't ride in the middle, then I'm not thinking that you're in ideal position. So subclinical hypothyroidism is very, very common, and you will get a lot of patients who will say, no, my labs all came back normal, and my doctor said that it must just be me. That's so unfair to the patient, because somebody did not do their due diligence in looking really, really good at those labs and saying, hey, this is the direction that you're heading. It's very obvious. We need to make some changes here. So if you have patients who are saying, look, I'm tired, my hair's falling out, I'm just gaining weight, no matter what I do, I can't lose it, etc., 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 and you come back and tell that patient that they're normal, I mean, that's just totally unfair whenever you could actually help them with some things. Alright, so for this picture, what you want to see here is that we have to have the iodide ions being absorbed from the GI tract. That means that you need to be eating foods that have this in them. So again, that subclinical patient, how can you help them? Tell them to eat good foods. Tell them to eat high quality protein. Tell them to go eat some seaweed snack packs that are super high in iodine, because your your thyroid is going to use more iodine in your body than any other gland. If you don't have the iodide there in order to have the iodine, then guess what? It's not going to work right, no matter what. So, what I really want you to see here is that number 1 and number 2 are vitally dependent upon what you're putting inside of your system. Okay? They've got to be eating well. And I already said, you could also tell that person, get rid of your fluoride so that it doesn't compete with your receptors. So there are things that you can do even if you're not going to be the doctor. People will really listen to what the nurses have to say, because they will spend so much more time with the nurse than they will with the doctor. So you have way more ability to help people and talk to them than you even think. Whenever you look at what's happening with this iodine, what you can see here, and number 3 is those iodine-containing molecules will become linked to form those thyroid hormones. If you don't have those molecules there, then you're not going to be able to make those hormones. So very, very important. The first 3 steps are integral in the production of these proper thyroid hormones. And then, of course, as we go on down, 4, 5, 6, 7, ultimately where we end up as 7 is we're going to have the T3 and the T4 bound to those transport proteins so that they can go through the bloodstream to get to all cells and tissues of the body. So, if you look at this next slide, thyroid hormones, star, highlight, underline, box, whatever you need to do to remember that these will affect almost every single cell in the entire body. This is why when people have hypothyroidism, they have symptoms in multiple places. They have things that are going wrong all over their body. Their skin is dry, their hair is falling out, they are super tired. You know, that's all over. That's the whole system. They're gaining weight everywhere from head to toe. And that's because thyroid hormones affect everything. So, when we're looking at children, it is absolutely essential to the normal development of various systems, but especially the nervous system. Whenever I am helping women who want to become pregnant, I need to know that their thyroid is exactly where it's supposed to be, because a hypothyroidism patient who hasn't had her thyroid properly addressed, doesn't have enough thyroid hormones for herself, much less for the baby, now we're going to look at a potential of having a mentally retarded child or a genetic issue because those thyroid hormones affect every cell in the body. So it's incredibly important to make sure that this is adequately addressed, especially for females who want to get pregnant and have babies. So I'm not going to read all of these to you. You can see here, again, we're affecting every cell inside of the body. So this is everything from your heart to your nerves to your respiratory system to your bones. All of it is going to be affected by the thyroid hormones. Thyroid hormones will activate genes involved in glycolysis and ATP production. This will result in the calorogenic effect. So think about one of the symptoms of hypothyroid patients is that they are very often cold. These are the people that you will see in the summertime wearing sweaters. So if they are wearing sweaters in the summertime, this is a wonderful opportunity and a great way to start talking to patients so that you learn how to communicate efficiently. If someone says that they always need to have a sweater. Now I get it if it's summertime and you're in a cold room. That makes sense. You know, they're cold because the AC may be on. But if they're walking around outside in the sunshine with a sweater on, now we've got a problem. So what is the problem? That increased energy consumption and heat generation of cells that should happen within the thyroid is not happening. So think about that wood and think about that fire. That fire is burning because T3 is metabolically active. That fire will warm you whenever it burns. But if the people who have hypothyroidism are not getting that fire, they are cold. This is why the exact opposite happens in hyperthyroidism. In hyperthyroidism, people are always hot. They can be in 35 degrees and wearing a tank top because they are so hot all the time because that fire is burning so hard. So the thyroid is working overtime. Okay? So that calorogenic effect is not only responsible for energy, but also for heat. Now, here's a clinical pearl for you, especially if you're going to be a person who's going to be responsible for taking vitals. Wherever you work, if you take vitals, it's vitally important to make sure that you're paying attention to people's temperature. Because if people constantly come in with a temperature that's lower than 98.6, and we know that's homeostasis, that's where our body should be. Now I understand there may be some occasional fluctuations, a little bit up, a little bit down, 99, okay, no big deal. 98.2, maybe no big deal. But if people are coming in and let's say they're at 100 degrees, then you're going to look at them and say, okay, your temperature is high. So you're running a little bit of a fever. Well, 98.6 is norm. So what's the difference between 98.6 and 100? Well, mathematically, that's 1.4 degrees higher. So if we go 1.4 degrees lower from 98.6, now we're at, 97.2. If a person is constantly coming in with a temperature around that 97.2, and you say to them, oh, you're fine, then you've missed the whole point of homeostasis. Because if you're going to tell the person with the high temperature that there's a problem, then you also need to say the same thing to the person with the low temperature. So I can't tell you how many times nurses I have seen say, oh no, a temperature of 97 is totally fine, where in fact it could be one of the very first signs that we've got a hypothyroid patient on our hands. It may not show up in blood work yet, but it could be coming. So if you're that person who's responsible for taking vitals, it is important for you to pay attention and to properly assess your patients and remember the principles of homeostasis. All right, so if we have homeostasis disturbed by decreasing T3 and T4 concentrations in the blood or low body temperature, then what's going to happen is the hypothalamus is going to say, oh my gosh, we don't have enough. Let's get some more. In order to get some more, the hypothalamus is going to release the TRH, Remember, that's the releasing signal to the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland to make TSH. So when the anterior lobe makes the TSH, then it will go stimulate the thyroid gland, and once that thyroid gland is stimulated, then the thyroid follicles can release that T3 and T4. Now, provided that everything works like it's supposed to. T3 and T4 concentrations can increase, and then that body temperature can rise up, restoring that homeostasis. There's a lot of different charts like this that will walk you through what happens if and how does it repair in order to get back to normal homeostasis. So I'm not going to go through all of those with you, but they're there for you to kind of walk through that as you're learning these processes, and as you can see, the physiology behind restoring homeostasis when it is disturbed. Alright, so C cells. Remember I said don't forget that thyroid is not just about T3, T4. Thyroid also will make calcitonin. Calcitonin is going to be released by those C cells that we talked about a little bit earlier, those parafollicular cells that are outside of the follicle. So when you're looking in the microscope in lab and you see that little cell outside of the follicle, it's not in line with the simple cuboidal epithelium, that's your C cell, and that is going to make a different hormone. That will make the calcitonin. This helps to regulate the concentration of calcium within the body. So it will stimulate calcium excretion by kidneys or prevent the calcium absorption by the digestive tract in order to ensure blood calcium does not get too high. Let me tell you a little bit about blood. I want you to remember this for the rest of your life. Blood is bougie. Blood is incredibly high maintenance. It wants its way. It wants to be very particular about certain things. So it wants to stay within this very tight and narrow range. So that's why I say blood is bougie. Because blood is bougie, it will make sure that it always gets its way as much as possible. Which is why whenever you get blood labs done, if you see something abnormal on that blood lab, then it's likely to have been going on for quite some time. It likely didn't just start yesterday. So, very important to know what your normal blood levels are of various things such as sodium, potassium, chloride, carbon dioxide, etc. So we don't want calcium too high, but we also don't want it too low. So the C cells that produce calcitonin are going to ensure that that blood calcium does not get too high. On the back of the thyroid gland, you have the parathyroid glands. Usually there are 2 pairs of these, so usually there's 4 total. There could be more or less, just depending upon the patient, but this is just the usual. 4 is the usual, and they're going to release PTH, or what we call parathyroid hormone. This is the antagonist for calcitonin. So remember, they work in opposite. The PTH is going to be secreted in response to low concentrations of calcium in the blood. So we just said that the calcitonin ensures the blood calcium doesn't get too high. PTH is going to ensure blood calcium doesn't get too low. Here's a picture of it. So again, posterior aspect of the parathyroid, or posterior aspect of the thyroid, is the parathyroid glands. In order for the parathyroid hormone to ensure that the blood calcium does not get too low, it can do a couple of things. One, it can stimulate osteoclasts. If you remember from 2401, these are basically the cleanup crew inside of the bone. They are the ones that can help break bone down and accelerate that mineral turnover. If you stimulate the osteoclast and you break the bone down, you're going to release calcium. So that's one of the ways that we can get the calcium raised in the blood, is to take it out of the bone. Obviously, that's not going to be healthy long term. So just keep in mind, this is one of the reasons, again, why you need to eat a healthy diet. You need to eat calcium-rich foods so that you're not borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. The other thing that parathyroid hormone can do is enhance the reabsorption of the calcium by the kidneys, reducing it in the losses within the urinary system. So we can say, okay, kidneys, don't let that calcium go. I need that. I need to put it over here into the blood. So that's another way the parathyroid hormone can work. Or it can stimulate the formation and secretion of calcitriol, which would be the D3, by the kidneys. So we know that the calcium absorption and vitamin D go hand in hand. So that's why that is important. Now, the third thing that is on here, one of the reasons why you listen to the PowerPoints, is the parathyroid hormone also has the ability to go into the GI tract and increase the absorption of calcium-rich foods. So if you're not eating calcium-rich foods, then obviously this isn't going to be an option. But again, if you're eating those calcium-rich foods, then instead of taking from the bones or messing with the urinary system, causing issues in the kidneys, we can just get it from the foods that we eat. Now, I know some people do like to take supplements. If you're going to take a supplement, just ensure that your supplements are made from whole foods. You don't want to take supplements that are made from synthetic chemicals. And you don't want to take calcium carbonate ever at any point in your entire life. If you have a grandparent who is taking calcium, then please go look at their supplement and see if it's calcium carbonate, because if it is, then that's basically the equivalent of them going outside and licking the sidewalk. And you would never tell your grandparent, well, just go outside and lick the sidewalk to get your calcium, because it's such a hard form of calcium and it takes so many steps to break down. It's very difficult to break it down and absorb it to utilize it properly. And sometimes this calcium can then start to accumulate on joints, causing joint pains, or in the kidneys, causing stones. And that is not what we want in our grandparents. So the best form to take is going to be a calcium lactate form, because it's very easy to break down. It doesn't have to go through as many steps. There's a lot of calcium citrate in supplements too. That's kind of in between the calcium carbonate and calcium lactate. So it's kind of on the medium level. It's not really great. The great one is going to be the calcium lactate. But even greater than that, getting it from your foods. So eating those things like bones within the salmon that are going to help with those calcium levels are going to be the best way to do that. So here's another little chart for you. If you have changes within calcium level, how are those hormones going to act in order to restore homeostasis? Same thing here, but in a different way. Okay, part C. In part C, we're going to start off with the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands are also known as your stress glands or your emergency glands. So make sure you write that down somewhere, because that is vitally important as we live in a world that is full of stress. I see more and more patients who are struggling in this area than I ever have before. So the adrenal glands, 2 reasons you should have a vitamin C rich food or smoothie before hitting, oh, that's supposed to say the gym, not the gym. Vitamin C rich food or smoothie. The 2 reasons are because, number 1, your adrenal glands will utilize more vitamin C than any other structure inside of your body, and they need it in order to function efficiently. And number 2, although working out at the gym is incredibly important, it is known as a stressor to the body. It's a good form of stress, but it is a form of stress, and your body does not necessarily determine, oh, well, they're just running on the treadmill in order to be healthy and to work out and to get some good exercise, from, oh, they're running away from a bear in order to save their life. Your body doesn't do that, okay? So the signals that are going to be sent are going to be stressor signals while you are working out. So make sure you have vitamin C to support your stress glands, and then also working out will produce a lot of free radicals in your body, and vitamin C acts as an antioxidant to help bind that up, so it makes you much healthier overall. These glands will lie along the superior border of each kidney. Remember, they are the 2-in-1 because they have a cortex as well as a medulla. So the cortex is going to store lipids, especially, circle the word, cholesterol, and fatty acids, because those are going to be vital for helping to manufacture the steroid hormones, the corticosteroids. The medulla, remember this is under the control of the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system and will produce epi and norepi when it is stimulated. So here's a picture of your adrenal glands sitting on top of your kidneys. Now, when I go through this picture, what I really want you to see is the importance of using your eyes to pay attention to what you're seeing in your patients. Because as a healthcare system, we've kind of gotten away from really paying attention to the patients. Doctors are so incredibly busy that very often they miss things that they could otherwise see had they not been looking down at a piece of paper or at a computer trying to take notes. I've been to a couple of doctor offices in the past, like OBGYN and things of that nature, where the doctor basically looks at the computer screen the entire time I'm talking and then types notes into the computer instead of actually looking at me. So that's kind of a little bit discouraging, because there are things that can be missed if you're not paying attention to the actual patient. So when you're looking at this, the lady who is on the far left of the screen, what you should see about her is that she's holding her weight in a different place than the lady next to her. So the first lady on the screen is holding her weight in the area of hips and thighs. Whereas the lady next to her, you can see that she has that bulging belly, especially below the belly button. She has like that sag that's kind of going on below the belly button, and yet she has thin arms and thin legs. Interesting. The lady next to her has weight kind of evenly distributed all over the place. So you can see that her biceps are quite thick. Her middle section is very thick. Her thighs are thick. Even her ankles are thick. She has weight evenly distributed. And then the man, you can see that he's holding all of his weight in the belly area, but especially in upper belly. These four pictures are patients who have different hormonal imbalances in different glands. The weight will be retained in the area near the weakest gland. So when we're looking at people holistically, we want to pay attention to everything that's going on. The lady who is on the very left side of the screen, that first lady who's holding weight in the hips and thighs area, this is ovarian issue. The lady next to her with the weight especially accumulated below the belly button, this is what the adrenal patient would look like. The lady next to her with the evenly distributed weight, this is the thyroid patient, because remember, thyroid will affect every cell. So her weight is evenly distributed, even from her face all the way down to her toes. And then the man, especially the weight above the belly button area, you can see that very obvious curve, that's liver. So different weaknesses, different hormonal issues can cause weight to be retained wherever there is weak points. And those are the points that we then want to go and address for these particular patients, because each one of them is going to need a different protocol because of what each one of them is currently suffering with. And then we can do lab work according to what we see, if we need more clarification or we need to be a better detective in figuring out some other things that we may have further questions about. The link above is information for you to go look at whenever we talk about the adrenal glands in Western medicine, which is here in America. Very often you will hear people say, oh, there's no such thing as an adrenal issue unless it's Cushing's or Addison's. Those are the only two adrenal diagnoses. I would just caution you to be very careful with saying that someone can't have a disease process that's in place if it's not Cushing's or Addison's. There are nurses, I have heard them before talk about how there's no such thing as adrenal fatigue and that's a made-up diagnosis. But if you think about it, from a physiological aspect, disease processes occur over time. You don't just go to sleep healthy one night and you wake up sick the next day. There's a progression of things. And as we're seeing things progress, if we can get the patient taken care of before they get that hard and fast, this is your diagnosis, sorry, it's going to be super hard to turn it around now. If we can catch them in the dis-ease phase, the dis-ease, the dis-ease phase allows for more of an opportunity to return the body back into a normal physiological state instead of allowing it to continue along the pathological process. Now, unfortunately, in medical school, there's very little time, if any, ever spent on nutrition. So not a lot of doctors know this. It's more of the holistic side of things where we look at more of an Eastern medicine philosophy, which is more of a preventive and proactive approach rather than a reactive prescription writing approach. If you're looking at this, what you can see right here is that adrenal patient who has all of that weight that's accumulating underneath the belly button didn't start out like this. So this is why it's important to know that there's a progression, and patients can be in a state of dis-ease before they're ever diagnosed with anything. This is why diet and exercise is incredibly important whenever it comes to true health, because it will change what's happening on the cellular level and help turn things back around. So starting out at the normal, you can see as this person progresses from stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 3, the changes that are occurring over time. Now, whenever we are looking at this particular patient, because this is an adrenal patient, it's important to, again, know your physiology. Your adrenal glands are your stress glands, and exercise is a form of stress. So if you take this person who's in stage 3 and you tell them to go do HIIT workouts, it could totally backfire. That is the person who doesn't want to do those particular workouts, because the person is already stressed enough. They already have enough of a hormone imbalance with their stress glands that we don't want to make it worse. So there's certain things that you have to do for certain patients. That's not going to be the same for everybody. Everything cannot be a one-size-fits-all approach. If you try to put all of your patients into a box and make everybody do the same thing, then you're going to be of disservice to a whole lot of people. You got to learn how to think outside of the box, and that's really what I want to teach you as we progress through this semester, is to break the box apart, forget about the box completely, and know your physiology so that you can help your patient or your mom or whoever it is to the best of your ability. So this person is already highly stressed. Instead, what we want to do for this person is very low stress exercises like Tai Chi or very easy yoga until we can get their adrenal glands back up to a state of health to the point where they can start working out again. They can, but it's going to take some time. Why is it going to take some time? Because we're talking about the endocrine system. And what is the endocrine system if not slow? It's definitely slow. So you cannot expect to turn this around in a short period of time, because this also did not progress in a short period of time either. All right, when we're looking at the different hormones that will come from the cortex versus the medulla, this chart is remarkable. You can see here that in the adrenal cortex, it's divided up into 3 different zones. So the adrenals are enclosed by a capsule, but in the cortex, we have the glomerulosa, the fasciculata, and the reticularis. And then in the middle interior portion of the adrenal gland, we have the medulla. From the glomerulosa, you will get mineralocorticoids, primarily aldosterone. So this is going to be a hormone that's going to target the kidneys, because it's going to be all about increasing the reabsorption of sodium and water. So aldosterone is going to hold on to sodium and water. We'll talk more later on about the regulatory control whenever we get into further chapters. The glucocorticoids, this one is huge. So coming from the fasciculata, we have the glucocorticoids, and the primary target you can see here is most cells. If you've never heard of cortisol, then I'm not sure where you've been, but maybe don't watch TV or watch commercials or anything of that nature. But cortisol is going to be released from this zona fasciculata within the adrenal cortex. When cortisol or cortisone is released, it's going to increase the rate of glucose and glycogen formation by the liver. Okay? So increasing the rate of glucose formation by the liver, which means we're going to increase our blood sugar. It's going to release amino acids from skeletal muscles, which means it's going to break down the skeletal muscles. And then lipids from adipose tissue. It will promote the peripheral utilization of lipids, and its goal is to have an anti-inflammatory effect. Now, let's turn this into a clinical picture so we don't just have words on a chart. Whenever people have high levels of inflammation, let's say they have poison ivy, oftentimes they'll go get a corticosteroid cream. That's because of its anti-inflammatory effects. Short term, that's fine. Short term, if you're going to use something that's going to have that cortisol or the cortisone in order to control inflammation, then okay. The problem is whenever people use the corticosteroids long term in order to control inflammatory processes like autoimmune diseases. The reason why that's problematic is because of all of the words that are before anti-inflammatory effects. Because if we're increasing the rate of the glucose utilization and we're releasing amino acids from skeletal muscles, what we're doing is we're causing an increase in your glucose levels, which is actually going to long-term be pro-inflammatory and very negative for your body. And it's going to cause issues with your pancreas because there's going to be so much glucose, and now insulin is going to have to come in and help. This is why there is a thing that's called steroid-induced diabetes mellitus. Very detrimental to the body to have long-term corticosteroid use. So again, we've got to get people on an anti-inflammatory diet. People should not be sitting around eating fried foods, processed foods, boxed foods, prepackaged foods. You've got to get people to eat foods that are bright in color, that have those properties in them that help fight inflammation, provide antioxidants to the system. People who have autoimmune diseases need to know about the autoimmune protocol, also known as the AIP diet. The AIP diet is high on foods that are anti-inflammatory in nature to help people with their imbalances in their inflammation and in their immune system. If you are secreting cortisol long term, the same thing could happen. So even if you're not using the corticosteroids, secretion of cortisol long term because you're always stressed can also lead to these same damaging properties inside of the body, which is why that adrenal patient will have that belly that is really large, especially below the belly button, because that cortisol is just making them add weight, add weight, add weight. But they have those little skinny bird legs and skinny little thin arms because of the release of the amino acids from skeletal muscle. They can't build the muscle. Their muscles are breaking down and degenerating. So very important whenever you're looking at that patient to realize some of the things that could be physiologically going on and how do you help. All right, the zona reticularis, so the hormone secreted here is androgens. The primary androgen is going to be testosterone. Androgens are male sex hormones, so adrenal androgens will stimulate development of pubic hair in both boys and girls. So girls, even though they're male sex hormones, girls are also going to have androgens as well, and females should have a small level of testosterone inside of their system as well. When females start aging and going through menopause, I've had patients who, when they get their blood work done, they come back and their testosterone is just in the tank. And it's like, well, no wonder that you're tired and you can't, formulate your skeletal muscles. Like the testosterone is just not there. And especially important for women who are married and say, you know, I really have no desire to have sex with my husband anymore. It's just not there. If that testosterone is in the tank, that could be one of the reasons why. Of course, there's other reasons. You got to be a good detective, but androgens are important in both males and females in homeostasis. Too much androgen in a female is going to lead a female to have a very flat chest, very deep voice, facial hair, start looking more like a male. And it will then definitely in turn affect other hormones, because your endocrine system is like a symphony. If you've never been to a symphony, then you don't know that if one instrument gets off, then everybody else sounds really bad. So it is dependent upon everybody to do their job exactly as they are supposed to create these beautiful sounds. The endocrine system is the same way. So many things are dependent upon other hormones working the way that they are supposed to. So if a female has high androgen levels, then that is certainly going to mess with her adipose levels, which are of course going to mess with her levels of gonadotropin releasing hormone. This is why, if you think about, let's just put it in perspective, think about an Olympic athlete, a female gymnast. Female gymnasts have very low body fat, very high androgens, very flat-chested, very muscular, and although that is very helpful for what they want to do at the time, at the Olympics, very often they suffer with other things later on down the road, like the inability to conceive a baby, because their hormone levels of their estrogen and progesterone have gotten so messed up because of the other things that they had going on. So the symphony has to work together. Everything has to do its job, or else you're going to domino effect other things down the road. And then lastly, the adrenal medulla. Remember, sympathetic control only. So again, this is your stress gland. If you think about the sympathetic nervous system, that is the side of the system that is going to release that epinephrine and that norepinephrine. This is the reason why moms who are in a car accident can pick up a car with their baby under it, because that sympathetic nervous system has got their heart pumping, it's got their skeletal muscles pumping. That epi and that norepi makes you have the ability to do some things that you otherwise would not be able to do because you are in a life or death situation. So if you, however, utilize this too much and too often, and you hurt your adrenal medulla because you're always stressed out and your stress never goes away. It's not just, you know, the car accident and okay, we're over it, and a week later everybody is fine, all of the cuts and the bruises and the scratches have healed, everything, we can move on. If you stay in that sympathetic dominant state where you're constantly worried, and every time you get behind a car now you're scared, or you know, have multiple kids and you have a lot going on, you're trying to work and you're trying to go to school and you don't get to sleep, and there's just constant stress, and your boss is asking you to do more and you're freaking out because you have to take more classes, and now you're all online and you're like, oh my gosh, I don't even know what to do. You know, that stress just keeps rolling and rolling and rolling and rolling to the point that eventually your adrenal glands are going to say, I can't do this anymore. Like, it's overwhelming, it's too much, I'm shutting down. That's where we get the diagnosis of chronic fatigue syndrome. So the chronic fatigue is a person who has experienced so much stress that their body is just shutting down. They're going into a completely different state because they no longer have anything on reserve. So I am going to have you do an assignment on stress so that you understand the importance of learning how to balance. Not all stress is bad stress. There is also good stress. Like if you want to, you know, go jump out of a plane because you think that sounds like so much fun, then, you know, maybe you and my husband can do it together, because I'm certainly not going to do it with him because that does not sound like fun to me, but he wants to. So if you have little bits of good stress here and there, that's okay, but you can't constantly be stressed out all the time and think that your body is going to work in the way that it should. You're going to take yourself down, and you're going to take yourself down way too early, and you could potentially end up with some chronic disease processes that you really don't want to deal with. I've had a number of patients who I have seen who have come in, and I know that their autoimmune disease was triggered by constant levels of stress. Now, let me also say, while we're here, so that I don't forget, if you're that person who's like, no, I'm not stressed, I'm fine. That was me as I was going through school as a single mom, getting my doctorate. I thought I was fine. Everybody else thought I was super high stressed. But because I had lived my entire life like that, I did not know what it felt like to feel normal. So I did not have a way to identify what stress actually felt like versus what normal felt like. If that's you, then you need to go get acupuncture. Because if you do acupuncture for stress, you will learn what your body is supposed to feel like on a normal state and not a stress state. So I really, really highly recommend acupuncture for people who say, I'm not stressed, but everyone else around me is telling me that I must be, and I wish they would shut up because I don't know what to do about it. There's the thing that you need to do about it. All right, so epi, norepi, we know that this will increase cardiac activity, blood pressure, glycogen breakdown. Just think about all of the things that would normally happen within a state of emergency. What are you going to do? So that way you don't have to memorize all of these little bitty tiny things, but just make it make sense for you on a clinical level. Here's your word slides for those of you who need words instead of a picture. Let me just talk right here really quickly on this one because I circled the effects of the glucocorticoids. I did speak on the picture about the anti-inflammatory effects. This will inhibit the activities of the white blood cells and other components of the immune system, which is why very often corticosteroids are given to people who have autoimmune diseases because they're trying to slow down the immune system. But the problem is what happens long term. So as I mentioned earlier, that AIP diet, there is a link for you that talks a little bit about the AIP diet so that you can share that with someone that you may know who has rheumatoid arthritis or type 1 diabetes or maybe multiple sclerosis, etc. There's so many autoimmune diseases, but that is a wonderful thing for people who have autoimmune disease to know. What should I eat in order to support my system? Okay, so for pineal gland, why you should sleep in total darkness. So the pineal gland will release the melatonin, but it is influenced by your circadian rhythms. If you don't know about your circadian rhythms, this is the 24-hour biological clock that your body goes on. We're going to talk more about the 24-hour biological clock when we get to the digestive system, so that's your little note right there. But it's important for you to sleep in total darkness because your pineal gland is also known as your third eye. So even if your eyes are closed, if there's light around you while you are trying to sleep, maybe from the neighbor's porch light coming through your window, or from your little blue light that is emitted from your TV or from your cell phone or whatever it may be, this is going to inhibit the proper release of melatonin, and therefore you will wake up. So you want to sleep in complete and total darkness. Very, very important that you get to secrete that melatonin, because sleep is the only time that your body gets to repair. Your body doesn't go through the repair processes throughout the day because you're doing too much activity. And cellularly, even if you're just sitting there watching TV, your cells still have to do a lot of metabolic activity. So the sleep is the time where everything kind of shuts down except for the brain, and everything is repair mode. If you're not repairing, then you are going to be aging at a much greater rate. And if you're not repairing, then you're potentially setting yourself up for some more chronic diseases later on. So with that melatonin, that's one of the effects, is the protection against the damage by free radicals. But you need to have that melatonin secreted, and it does so according to light, and circadian rhythms. If you've ever been a casino, you know the casinos do not have windows because they do not want you to go to sleep. They're very bright. The lights are everywhere. And they do that on purpose because they want you to stay up and gamble. You'll make more mistakes whenever you're gambling at 3 a.m. than you will at 3 p.m. because your body is saying, I should be asleep right now, but you haven't released enough melatonin because there hasn't been enough darkness there. People who work night shift are also going to have problems with this gland as well, because if you don't use it, you lose it. So the longer you work night shift, the more the pineal gland will atrophy and the worse your melatonin production will be, which is why even after you quit your night shift job and move to day shift, it still takes a very long time to get back to normal because of the atrophy that has been done to the pineal gland. So for the pancreas, remember that this is going to be in two systems. We have the pancreas in the digestive system and in the endocrine system. And for this reason, the pancreas does a lot of work, and it's very underappreciated and very often highly abused with the way that we eat in America, known as the Standard American Diet, or the SAD. It is very sad the way that we really hurt our pancreas by eating such high carbohydrate foods on a regular basis. So this gland is going to be in between the inferior border of the stomach and then the proximal portion of the small intestine, which is called the duodenum. It's mostly retroperitoneal, which means that it is behind, so retro behind, that peritoneal membrane that is going to be within the abdominal pelvic cavity. It contains exocrine and the endocrine cells because of the digestive and hormone function. Majority of the pancreas is going to be for exocrine function. Remember, exo means that it's going to exit the body. So whenever the pancreas is working in the digestive system, it is going to secrete an alkaline fluid that's going to help the digestive system and make sure that food is properly broken down so that it can be utilized as it should be. We'll learn more about that in the digestive system. So for right now, let's just focus on the endocrine portion of the pancreas and how it helps regulate blood sugar levels. Here's a picture of the pancreas so you can see what it looks like as it is very, very close to that duodenum, and that is where it's actually going to secrete its exocrine products, that digestive juice. But for the endocrine portion, you're going to see little cells that will form clusters known as pancreatic islets, or the islets of Langerhans. Inside of these islets, you'll have a couple of different cell types. The alpha cells are going to be responsible for producing glucagon, and the beta cells will be responsible for producing insulin. Delta cells will produce a peptide hormone that's identical to the growth hormone inhibiting hormone. This will suppress the release of glucagon and insulin by other islet cells, and then slow the rate of food absorption and enzyme secretion along the digestive tract. You will also find PP cells, pancreatic polypeptide cells. This is going to inhibit gallbladder contractions and regulates the production of some pancreatic enzymes. So again, exocrine and endocrine function, but the main two things we're going to focus on are going to be the alpha and the beta cells because of the hormone production with the glucagon and the insulin for blood sugar regulation. So here's a picture of that islet. You can see what it looks like whenever you're looking at it underneath the microscope. When your blood glucose levels increase, then the beta cells are going to work to secrete the insulin in order to get that glucose into the cells within your body. So if you eat a really high carbohydrate food, let's just take for example a muffin that has sugar crystals all over the top. So you have a lot of sugar, the wheat converts to sugar or flour, whatever you're using. It's going to convert into sugar. So you have sugar in the muffin, sugar on the top of the muffin. That is glucose. Do not get that confused with the hormone glucagon, because glucagon is a hormone, whereas glucose is sugar. So whenever you eat a high carbohydrate food, what happens is your blood glucose level increases. Remember I told you that blood is very bougie. And blood wants to maintain a very strict, narrow range. Some labs will say between 80 and 100. Some labs will say between 70 and 100 in regards to glucose levels within the blood. So in order to keep it within that strict range, what has to happen is insulin has to be secreted so that it can go help move the glucose out of the blood and into a tissue. Let's just take, for example, a skeletal muscle. So we've got to get it out of the bloodstream and move it over into, let's say, your thigh muscle. Now, once everything has been moved in to your muscles or to your liver or anywhere that it's going, if your blood glucose levels get back within a normal range, then that's good. If, however, let's say you have not eaten for a very long time, let's say you're working a 12-hour shift, you do not have time to stop, then it is possible that your blood glucose level will drop too low because you have not eaten. So in order to keep you from just passing out on the floor, your alpha cells are going to receive a signal that says, hey, this person's blood glucose level is dropping too low. We want to make sure that we keep them in homeostasis, so the alpha cells are going to secrete glucagon in order to stimulate glycogen breakdown and then glucose release by the liver. So what is glycogen? Glycogen is the stored form of glucose. Whenever you ate that muffin 12 hours ago, any extra glucose that your body did not utilize right then is going to be stored in your liver as glycogen. So there's a backup reserve. That backup reserve is what can be broken down if you do not eat for many, many hours. So when that backup glycogen is broken down, glucose is going to be released by the liver to go into the bloodstream so that the blood is happy and the levels are maintained. It's very important to understand how the insulin and the glucagon work together to regulate the levels of blood glucose appropriately in order to keep people in homeostasis. Obviously, this is going to be disturbed in things like type 2 diabetes, where the blood sugar regulation is no longer working on a homeostatic level. So we'll talk about that in just a minute, but to help in differentiating between glycogen and glucagon, there's a little mnemonic down there for you to help you remember the difference. Sometimes whenever people start seeing glucagon, glycogen, and glucose, things get a little bit confusing. So make sure that you keep those things separate and you're able to certainly identify what the role is on each one of those whenever it comes to regulating blood sugar levels. All right, so we'll talk a little bit more about insulin. Again, remember, these are going to be released by the beta cells in response to high levels of blood glucose. There are insulin receptors on the majority of body tissues. You have cells in the brain and kidneys, the digestive tract, and even red blood cells that will lack insulin receptors. So these cells are called insulin independent because they can absorb and use glucose without insulin stimulation. Other cells and tissues within the body will need to have insulin. So basically, insulin is going to be like a friend to your body and make sure that you don't have high levels of blood glucose, which can really cause lots of problems inside of the system. The effects on the target cells include accelerating that glucose uptake. Again, we want to move it out of the bloodstream and get it into the tissue. That is the goal. Accelerating the glucose use to enhance ATP production, so that can provide an energy boost whenever you are using everything appropriately. Again, this is why, some people who do training specific activities will carb load because they think it helps them with the increased ATP production. And you have to understand that there is, again, a balance in this. Your activity levels are going to definitely make an effect whenever it comes to how much glucose you're actually utilizing. If all you do is sit around on the couch all day long, or you have a desk job where you really don't get up and you don't move, you are not going to need that same level of glucose as that athlete who is burning massive amounts of calories and doing really, really high levels of activity. Anybody who has too much glucose in their system that they do not utilize, that will be stored as glycogen in the liver, but then also the insulin is a signal to stimulate what we call triglyceride formation in the adipocytes. So what does that mean? That means that insulin is a signal for fat storage. So I hope you let that sink in for a little bit. If you are constantly eating high carb foods, you will constantly be secreting insulin from your pancreas, because that's the role of the beta cells. As long as that insulin is frequently released, then you are telling your body it's time to uptake the glucose and time to store fat. So any calories that you don't use right away are going to be converted into triglycerides, and those will be stored in your fat cells. This can lead to fatty liver disease, obesity, type 2 diabetes, or even pancreatitis. Again, this is another reason why lower carb diet is going to be beneficial when it comes to people who have either type 2 diabetes, they are pre-diabetic, or they have very low levels of activity. They're very sedentary. They don't do a lot of activity throughout the day. Therefore, they do not need these higher glucose levels. This is why also whenever people cut carbs from their diet, they tend to lose weight pretty quickly, because their signals to store fat are no longer there anymore, since those insulin levels are no longer high. So keep that in mind. High glucose equates to high insulin, which equates to high fat. So you've got to keep those things aware of your body, so that whenever it comes to treating your patients, if you're finding high glucose levels on the blood labs, or I even make my patients get their insulin levels as well, I'm looking at both of those to determine what's going on with this patient, as well as where are the triglyceride levels. That's going to give me an indication of how they are eating, even if they try to lie to my face. Alright, so glucagon is the antagonist. This is going to be released by the alpha cells again, and this is going to be released when the signal is our glucose levels within the blood are dropping, and we need to make sure that this person has enough blood glucose to continue to carry on throughout their day and not just pass out on the floor. So what it's going to do is it's going to stimulate the breakdown of that glycogen, remember, which is stored glucose. It will break down the glycogen that you may have in your skeletal muscle fibers or within your liver cells. It will break down the triglycerides within the adipocytes, and it will also stimulate the production and the release of glucose within the liver cells. So the goal here is to make sure, again, that blood glucose levels are maintained within a homeostatic range. So the glucagon is going to break down all stored forms in order for them to be utilized. This is why things like fasting will cause you to have lower levels of insulin and higher levels of glucagon. And as that glucagon starts working on breaking down the stored sugars or the stored fats, then the weight also starts to come off, because you're now utilizing your reserves instead of adding on more reserves. Alright, so the alpha cells and the beta cells will monitor the blood glucose concentration, and they're going to secrete either the glucagon or the insulin without endocrine or nervous instructions. So keep that in mind. It is simply the blood sugar that is being monitored, and that is the signal for the alpha cells to release glucagon or the beta cells to release insulin. We don't need signals from the brain. We don't need signals from other hormones. Just need to know what's happening with the blood, because remember, it's bougie. And if it's not happy, the pancreas wants to make it happy. Now, that being said, because the alpha cells and the beta cells are highly sensitive to changes within that blood glucose level, any hormone that affects the blood glucose concentration indirectly can then affect the production of both insulin and glucagon. Remember, this is a symphony. So if there are hormones that are affecting the blood glucose concentration, then it is going to spur up either the alpha cells or the beta cells to start their production of their own hormones. The other thing is you can have autonomic activity influencing insulin production. So the parasympathetic side of the autonomic nervous system, the side for rest and digest, will stimulate the insulin release, and the sympathetic stimulation inhibits it. So remember, you're really supposed to only eat whenever you're in a parasympathetic state, whenever you're resting, so that your body can properly digest. Really, the time to eat is not whenever you're stressed out. Whenever you're stressed out, your body does not have the capability to properly utilize those nutrients. And so stress eating is not only bad from a psychological aspect, but also from a digestive aspect as well. And that's because of the roles that those systems play whenever it comes to the digestion of food and the hormone regulation. So just keep that in mind as you are working with patients. If you're seeing patients who are constantly stressed, they're very busy, they always have something to do, I gotta go through the drive-thru in order to pick up something to eat because I have to get Johnny to soccer, and I have to get little Sally to dance, and I need to go pick up the dry cleaners before they close, and they're just da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Those people are in sympathetic overdrive. They live their lives stressed out, and it is definitely going to catch up with them and negatively affect them when it comes to the digestive system, and then it's going to flow over into the endocrine system as well. So again, here's one of your little charts that will help you to determine what's going to happen if you have homeostasis disturbed by increasing blood glucose levels. How do we get it back down to normal? And the opposite. If it's decreasing blood glucose, how do we get it back up to normal? So hyperglycemia is abnormally high glucose levels within the blood. So of course the opposite of that would be hypoglycemia, abnormally low glucose levels within the blood. Either one of those means that homeostasis is disturbed. Whenever it comes to hyperglycemia, this is a key condition that we have to address when it comes to diabetes mellitus. So in diabetes mellitus, there is high glucose concentrations that overwhelm the reabsorption capabilities of the kidneys, therefore causing the glucose to appear within the urine and causing an increase in the urine volume, which we call polyuria. So whenever you hear someone say, man, I just have to drink water all the time, I can't get enough, I feel like I just pee it out, key into that. Make your ears kind of perk up a little bit. Ask more questions so that you can get a greater understanding of, are they just really thirsty? Is it just this day? Does this happen all the time? That way you can kind of learn how to communicate with people and ask questions that will make you more like a detective so that you can work on figuring out what's going on with that person. Type 1 diabetes mellitus is an autoimmune disease. In this particular case, what's happening is the immune system is attacking the beta cells within the pancreas, and therefore they are not able to secrete adequate insulin levels. So these patients are going to require the daily injections or that continuous infusion of insulin. These are the people that you may see who have the insulin pumps because they have type 1 diabetes. Their immune system is attacking the pancreas and not allowing the proper production of insulin. So whenever they eat carbs and they have high blood sugar, their body needs help in order to regulate that. This usually occurs in children or very young adults. This is usually diagnosed very early on. Most cases are within the first few years of a child's life, they realize that there's something going on. So it's kind of rare, but it is possible to see it later on in young adults. There is a milk protein that has been associated with this, and research has been done regarding this A1 beta-casein milk protein that is implicated in some of the autoimmune conditions of type 1 diabetes mellitus. So I put two little articles there for you to read. If you have young children, you plan on having children soon, especially if you know people who are weaning their kids either from breast milk or formula, and now they're going to start going in the direction of cow's milk. It is important to be aware and very knowledgeable about the fact that this is out there. If you've seen these milks at the store, these A2 milks, that's what this is about. If you've ever wondered, what the heck is that? That is a milk that does not have that A1 beta-casein milk protein, with the goal of helping to ensure that the body doesn't get cross-reactivity and then set up that autoimmune disease of type 1 diabetes. Now, I will also say that there are other things that are out there that are available in regards to different non-animal protein milks, so the plant-based milks. There are ways to do that. However, you do want to ensure that your child is getting all the other proper nutrients, plenty of healthy fats as well, because they need fats in order to help grow their brain, other parts of their body. So there are ways to do it. You just have to know what you're doing, and maybe even work with someone who has more knowledge than you in regards to the different components that the children need while they are growing for good, adequate, healthy nutrition. Type 2 diabetes mellitus is the most common form. This is what we call a lifestyle disease, okay? Write that down. This is a lifestyle disease. This is a disease that occurs because of the choices that a person has consistently made over their life. Consistently eating high carbohydrates all day, every day, and their pancreas has said, you know what, I'm sick of it. That's enough. It's going to start downregulating. We're going to start to get insulin resistance because of the downregulation, because of the constant stimulation of the glucose. Now, whenever you have your pancreas not working appropriately anymore, or that insulin is there but it's not responding because things have become resistant, now you're going to have a problem with blood sugar levels, and the body is not going to be able to utilize that glucose properly. This is usually associated with obesity. Not all people with type 2 diabetes have to be obese. I've seen patients before who are very thin, but they have type 2 diabetes. So don't let just the obesity be the key marker that you're looking for, because it doesn't always happen. 90% of the time it will happen. They will be obese. So weight loss in those particular instances can be an effective treatment. If they cut out those carbs and they start losing that weight, then yes, we can reverse this thing. It is definitely possible to reverse type 2 diabetes, but it takes time, again, because endocrine system is slow. So there should not be an expectation that a disease process that you built up over the last 10, 15, 20, 30 years of your life is going to go away in 2 weeks of dieting. It doesn't work that way. So people need to understand that the damage that you did along these years, you can't just undo in a matter of a few weeks. Now, I have taken some patients through very intense purification protocols. I have some patients who were on like up to 3 different type 2 diabetes medications, and they end up coming off of all of them at the end of their little 3-week period, and then were able to stay off of them because of the way that they completely changed their diet. So whenever you're looking at blood labs, one of the things that you want to look at, in addition to glucose levels and insulin levels, is your A1C levels. The A1C, the hemoglobin A1C, is a better indication of what that patient has been doing over the past few months. So some patients will come in and they will say, oh, I've been eating my carrots and my celery and my produce, and I haven't really been eating bread or anything like that. Okay, that's great. They think that if they just do that for a few days before they come in for their appointment, then their blood labs are going to show good. But if a hemoglobin A1C gets pulled on the blood lab, they're really not going to be able to lie their way out of that one, because that one's going to show kind of what's been going on for the past 3 months. So you may have been eating good for the past 3 days, but for the past 3 months, we're going to find out by pulling this number here. It should be below a 5.6 in the healthy range. Now you see the 5.7 to 6.4 goes into prediabetes, 6.5 and above is in diabetes. There's not a lot of space in between those numbers there. So if I have a patient who comes back, matter of fact, just the other day I had a lady come in and her hemoglobin A1C was at 5.3. And I told her 5.3 may be in the normal range, and you may think that because it's in the normal range this is okay, but you're only 0.4 away from getting into technically prediabetes. So if you continue in this direction, you're going to be there before the end of the year. So we have to do lots of changes here. I don't want to see anything that's even close to 5 whenever we're looking at blood labs on the holistic side. Other doctors may be fine with it. I'm not fine with it because I know what's coming later on down the road, and we need to educate the patients on what will happen with type 2 diabetes mellitus if they do not take it seriously. It's more than just a weight issue. Oftentimes they will come in for weight, like she came in for weight, but we need to explain the whole process beyond the weight. So here's what we need to make sure our patients understand. The complications of the untreated or even poorly managed diabetes will include degeneration and damage across different organs from head to toe. So all the way from brain and eyes, all the way down to your kidneys, and even potentially loss of your big toes or your whole foot or your lower half of your leg. That's because blood sugar levels that consistently stay high are going to destroy peripheral vascular circulation, and they will destroy the nerves. So you will have multiple issues that will come up in different parts of the body, because when you're looking at that microvasculature, the tiny, tiny, tiny little blood vessels that go all the way, like let's say to the tips of your fingers or to the tips of your toes, those things you have to keep healthy or else you are going to have damage. So blood sugar consistently high in the blood vessels tears up those blood vessels. It will damage the vessels, it will damage the nerves, and whenever you look at parts like your eyes that have these little bitty tiny things, or your kidneys that have these little bitty tiny microvasculature, this is why these things can be damaged in a type 2 diabetic patient, because that blood sugar really destroys the vessels as it stays high. So again, got to keep those numbers regulated within a normal level and make sure that that patient is following through on things that they need to do in order to properly manage that diabetes, or if we can get a hold of them before they get there, then that will be even easier to shift them back into normal physiology and normal health. Now, I highlighted here in red, early heart attacks, 3 to 5 times more likely for people who have diabetes. We'll talk more about that when we get into the cardiovascular system, but I need you to remember that because everybody thinks about heart attacks associated with cholesterol, but nobody wants to talk about blood sugar and how detrimental high blood sugar is to your cardiovascular system. So I just explained the microvasculature, but of course now we're looking at the heart. The heart can really undergo some serious damage whenever we're looking at type 2 diabetes. So it's very important for anybody who may have high blood sugar levels for you to discuss with them what they could potentially be setting up negatively in their cardiovascular system. All right, so then the organs with the secondary endocrine functions, Again, we saw this on one of the slides in the very beginning of the PowerPoint. Whether it's intestines, kidneys, heart, thymus, gonads, we will go into those in their respective chapters. So here's one little chart that will kind of outline all of those things, but there is greater detail in the next 7 slides. If you want to learn a little bit more about those right now, then feel free to read over those slides. But as I said, we will go into that with greater detail later on because I know there's already so much information in this current PowerPoint slide. Okay, and then here is a very big chart where you have multiple different hormones that we've gone through that you can look at what the name of the hormone is, maybe even the abbreviation. What would happen if we have underproduction or that tissue insensitivity? What would be the signs and the symptoms within the patients? What would you see that may lead you to suspect that they would have a problem with the hormone named in the first column versus overproduction or hypersensitivity? What would happen if there's too much of that hormone? And then what would be some signs and symptoms of those particular issues? So I highly encourage you to maybe even keep this chart for later on, especially if you're going into nursing and you're going to be taking some other exams. This is pretty outlined for lots of different test questions that you may see. So this is a pretty good chart to hold on to and keep long term. All right, let's get into stress. So stress is any condition that will threaten homeostasis. The general adaptation syndrome is also called the stress response, and this just basically says how does the body respond to those stress-causing factors. The man who basically talked about the GAS has divided this into 3 different phases: the alarm, the resistance, and the exhaustion phase. If you look at this chart here, what you can see on the alarm phase is we first start with a stressor. And again, that stressor can be threatening, or it could be something that you consider to be of great value or great fun. Earlier I said maybe jumping out of a plane. Maybe that sounds like a great idea to some people, and that would be exhilarating. For some people, it may be starting their own business. That could be a stressor, but it could be incredibly exhilarating as you work to become an entrepreneur. Whatever the stressor is, the alarm phase is the first phase where the body initially responds to that stressor, which changes that lower your resistance level. So there's a little bit of lower resistance. As you can see, the graph kind of goes and dips down a little bit. Think about the blue line as homeostasis. And so you dip down a little bit below homeostasis as you have that stressor. Now, if the stressor continues beyond a few hours, a few days, then the body is going to start to mobilize to withstand the stress, and it's going to try to accommodate, try to shift hormones or different things in order to get back to normal. So that's the goal. If, however, that stress is ongoing, it never stops, you never take a break. So, for example, I'm going to talk about my mom in this particular instance. My mom is a physical therapist. She works at a hospital. She also does home health, and she has horses and land and 2 different houses and takes care of a ton of different things. My mom will go and go and go and go and go, and she lives in sympathetic dominant state, always very, very stressed out, and she never stops to really take care of herself. So what happens is she will try, her body will try to accommodate, but it eventually gets to the point to where she will go down. And when she goes down hard. So she'll go down for a week, sometimes 2 weeks, where she will just be in bed. She can't move, she can't leave, she can't work because she's so sick. But that's because she has gone on into the exhaustion phase. So extreme stressors that deplete the body's resources. She does not have the ability to function at normal during those times because she is literally exhausted. So when she realizes she's at that point, she doesn't even try to do anything, because her goal is, let me lay here for a little while, and then once I am able to get up and move forward, I'll go right back to what I'm doing. Now, that is exactly what you don't want to do. What you should do is realize that you have basically burned the candle at both ends, you've exhausted your body's resources, and you should learn from that and say, I will not continue along that path. Because what's going to happen is, if you do continue along that path, even if you return to homeostasis the first, second, third time around, ultimately what you can see there is that down arrow into illness and into death. My mom, although she is 57 years old, looks like she's probably 10 years older than that. Her body is just breaking down, and you can see it on the outside as she's going into the stages of illness. So she thinks she's returning back to homeostasis, but she's not. She's on the illness, on the down category. And we've talked about it before. She knows it, but this is how she's always been. And so sometimes you have patients who don't want to change. They feel like the lifestyle that they're living is where they want to be, and they don't really see the need for change. And in those particular instances, all I can do is try to be as supportive as I can in whatever ways that I can. So I can't force her to make a change, just as you're going to find there are patients who you may know that, wow, this patient, if they would just do this, this, and this, then they would be so much better, but they don't want to. There are many patients who are going to come across your path that will just say, look, just give me whatever the pill is that I need in order to keep going, because I'm not going to slow down and I'm not going to stop. Those are usually your OCD type A driven patients. That would be my mom. So she takes Tylenol every day because she gets headaches every single day. And she knows that Tylenol is not good for her, and she continues to do it anyways because she just wants the headache to go away so that she can continue to do her work. So I also used to be in that state, but after learning all of this and getting into holistic nutrition and listening to my husband constantly saying, I'm not going to watch you die of a heart attack or a stroke. You are going to slow down, and you are not going to work that hard, and you are going to take breaks. It was very hard for me at first to just sit still and do nothing, so I understand the reason why my mom wouldn't do it, very much like her, but my husband forced me to. So I really didn't have any choice, and it's good to have somebody like that in your life who will put their foot down and say, I'm going to do what's best for you, even if you won't do what's best for you. So I have learned how to get back into the homeostasis and make sure that I am doing the right things when appropriate in order to live a long, healthy, good quality life, not only for myself, but also for my husband and my kids as well, who definitely need me. So this is why I'm going to have you guys do the stress assignment, because you need to know whenever you're going through school, or whenever you're trying to accomplish a goal like getting to get into nursing, or get into dental hygiene, or get into the radio program, if you're going to do radiology, if you're going to do sauna, whatever you're going to do, it can be quite stressful, and there can be a lot of stuff on your plate all at one time, especially if you have kids and you work and you're married. I mean, that is a heavy, full plate that is like overflowing. So the stress assignment is really for you guys to figure out what it is that you can do to help support your natural physiology. How can you kind of take a step back every once in a while whenever you feel yourself getting really stressed out, and return your body to homeostasis by something that you really enjoy? So I hope that you really like that stress assignment. It's really built for you long term. Sometimes I get some papers that are just absolutely phenomenal. Some have brought me to tears. So I encourage you, whatever you do in your assignment, keep it on your desktop. So then in those days, whenever you're stressed, you can go back and you can reread what you wrote. Because it's easy for us to forget as we get on our train of, let's do this, let's go, I got this, I got this, I got this, I got this, I got this. So keep that assignment nearby until you are out of school and you feel like you have reached your goals. Alright, so this is just your word slides that will kind of describe some of those things that I went through on the picture. So to sum this all up, there are some hormones that are important to growth. You can see, obviously, growth hormone is going to be one of them. Thyroid hormone, we talked about a little bit in regards to the necessity for proper system development, including the nervous system. Insulin, PTH, calcitriol, reproductive hormones, all of those are very important to growth. Not going to go into those in great detail, but I do have slides on those for you to kind of just read on your own. It's pretty self-explanatory in regards to the necessity for those hormones for growth. Alright, and then this picture will be at pretty much the end of all of the PowerPoint slides for this semester. This basically will just integrate whatever system we are currently learning with other body systems that you have learned in the past. So as you can see, the skeletal, muscular, nervous, and the integumentary system were all talked about in 2401. So now we're just adding the endocrine system on top of that. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I look forward to seeing and reading your responses for your homework assignments.